The Dangling Woman by William Bunce. Owen winked at Sam, the studio engineer, as the voice on his headphones droned on.
I don't know why he would run around on me, the voice was saying. After 20 years, he tells me he's seeing another woman. I swear she's young enough to be his daughter.
The quiver in her voice told him she was about to burst into tears, but he headed her off. Now, my dear, he soothed. It's not uncommon for an older man to become involved with a woman half his age. It's not the end of the world. Give him a little time, and when he finally pulls out of his tailspin, your marriage will be stronger than ever.
He told me he wants to see a lawyer.
Her words dissolved into a torrent of sobs. This woman wasn't about to listen to reason, Owen decided. Her blubbering was starting to break up his sound quality. Sorry, he said brightly. I have to give some time to the folks who pay the bills. Thanks for calling. He punched out line number 3. This is your personal marriage counselor, Dr. Owen Stanford, here to provide comfort and advice to those lonely voices in the night. We'll be right back after a few words from Alpine Dog Food. Food your pooch would climb a mountain for. After cueing in the dog food tape, he leaned back in the chair and stared at the lights blinking on his console, every one representing some small portion of human misery. Suffering cells, isn't that what the station manager had said? Now his sponsors were fighting each other for airtime, and a more lucrative contract was in the works. Owen had found his niche. As long as the faithful were willing to lap up his bland prescriptions for marital bliss, he was willing to dish them out. Sam came into the booth with the freshly delivered pizza still steaming in the box. If you ask me, that last dame was the pits. With a voice like that, it's no wonder hubby ran out on her. Yeah, she was a whiner, wasn't she? That was the only trouble with this job, Owen thought. Rarely did a man call in to discuss a problem. He was forced to listen to a never-ending chorus of whining women. Then he had to go home to Marcia, the worst whiner of the lot.
Why don't you set up practice like a professional? A bartender has better hours than you do. Only trash wash their dirty linen in public.
On and on it went. Unfortunately, he couldn't silence his wife with the mere push of a button. But there were other ways. He threw his headset on just in time to catch the closing of the ad. Alpine Dog Food, he crooned. Your pooch would climb a mountain for it. Owen twirled his hand over the board like a magician about to produce a rabbit out of a hat and pressed the number 3 button. Dr. Owen Stanford here, and what is your problem? There was no answer. Dead air, the worst thing that can happen in radio. Cursing under his breath, he reached for a slice of pizza. Seems we have a teeny case of stage fright out there, he said into the mic. Don't be shy, my dear. Pretend you're talking to your oldest and dearest friend. Nothing. Outside the booth, Sam drew a finger across his throat. Owen was just about to hit the next button when a sound came over the line. It was so low and hoarse and buried in static he couldn't make it out at first. You'll have to speak up if you want to stay on the air, he warned. My husband, the voice said. It was still barely audible. For some reason, Owen was reminded of the times as a child he had held a seashell up to his ear and listened to the throb of waves on a distant shore. He turned up the volume slightly. Your husband, madam? What about your husband? This time the voice was clearer. What do you think of a man who does violence to his wife? Owen jolted upright in his seat, his face the color of the cardboard box in front of him. He yanked off the earphones and flung them down on the console. His eyes were pinned to the little red number 3 light. Something the matter, Doc? Sam raced into the booth just in time to catch him as he stumbled over some cables on the floor. Owen wiped the perspiration from his brow and tried to collect himself. That voice, it sounded just like... Just like who? He looked at the fat, good-natured face of his engineer. No, he said, shaking his head. It's nothing, Sam. Look, would you mind cueing in some music while I splash some water on my face? Sure, Doc. He helped him over to the door. Go pull yourself together. Looks like you've seen a ghost. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the station was deserted except for Sam and him, but he went down a darkened corridor to a payphone and called a number he'd written on a piece of paper.
He counted as the phone rang 3 times. On the 4th, someone picked up the receiver, and a gruff voice said, "Hello? This is Owen Stanford. What in blazes went wrong?" "Wrong? Nothing went wrong." The man sounded offended. "I told you, I'm a professional at this business." "Marcia must have gotten out of it," he hissed into the phone. "She just called me over the air." There was a pause at the other end. "Did she say she was your wife?" "No, but—" "Then how do you know it was her?" The voice was calm, analytic, and there was a certain contempt for Owen's panicky thinking. "Look," the man continued, "I did it just like I planned it. I went in through the bedroom window you left unlatched and let her have it while she was listening to your show. She must have sensed me in the room. Funny thing was, she didn't scream or anything. She just said, 'Owen sent you, didn't he?' I said, 'Yeah,' and he paid me a bundle. Then I hit her. If you know the right spot, it only takes once. I checked her pulse just to make sure. Luckily, she was still dressed, so I took her car out to Indian Point and dropped her over the edge. Must be 500 feet down to the highway. A few cars will probably run over her in the fog before they find the body. All the loose ends have been tied together neatly. Nothing to worry about, pal. Not many of my clients have a live radio show for an alibi." Owen leaned against the wall. "Maybe you're right. My nerves are getting the best of me." "Sure. And one more thing, pal." "What's that?" "You come blabbing over the phone again, and you'll join your missus." "Sorry to bother you." Owen slammed down the phone. The hitman was right. It must be his imagination. How could a woman, bludgeoned to death, dumped over the side of a cliff, and run over by some passing cars, pick up a phone and badger him over the air? No, the whole idea was ridiculous. If he had only continued the conversation, he would have found the caller to be a total stranger. Another poor slob looking for a mental massage, just like the rest. He went into the men's room and washed his face with cold water. It made him feel a lot better. He looked at his face in the mirror. 50 years old, and he still had his good looks. Too good to waste on some over-the-hill crone who didn't appreciate his celebrity status. There were plenty of young women out there aching to hook up with a radio personality like himself. After an appropriate period of mourning, Dr. Owen Stanford was determined to accommodate them. He ran through the next few hours in his mind. If he didn't get a call from the cops first, he'd go straight home from the studio and report Marcia's disappearance. They'd find her empty car at the top of Indian Point, and her body hundreds of feet below on the highway. Of course, he would mention her recent depression. The thought made him smile. Marcia was nothing, if not depressing. Owen returned to the booth with his confidence restored. Sam was sitting in his swivel chair, finishing the last piece of pizza. "You feeling okay? I figured you didn't want any of this, so I saved you the trouble of throwing it out." "I'm all right now. For a minute, I felt sick at my stomach." The engineer got up and brushed the crumbs from his lap. "None of your customers gave up hope." He pointed to the bank of red lights, all blinking in happy unison. "Sure must be a lot of washed-up marriages out there. Glad I never got the urge." Owen sat down and hit the mic switch. "Sorry for the slight delay. This is Dr. Owen Stanford, back to speak with you about your marriage problems." He pressed button number 1. "And how might I help you, my dear?" For the next hour, everything ran smoothly. There was the usual assortment of infidelities, desertions, boring partners, typical complaints that Owen had come to expect over the last 2 years. For every agonized question, he reached into his bottomless box of glib answers. Sometimes he wondered why all those dim-witted housewives never caught on. $200 to a prestigious-sounding diploma mill, a smooth way with words, and you were in business. Just before dawn, it happened again. He had finally got rid of a woman whose husband had gambled away their life savings when the same voice came back on number 3. The question was also the same. "What do you think of a man who does violence to his wife?" This time, Owen was ready. "I don't think there's any place in a sound marriage for that sort of thing. Have you considered, however, that it's not you he is striking, but someone or something else that's been bothering him? Perhaps your failure to recognize his difficulties has aggravated the situation." He relished turning the tables on them with half-baked psychology. Pretty soon he would have her apologizing for having been beaten. He also knew the collective ear of his audience was waiting for the lurid details. "You said he does violence to you. What sort of violence do you mean exactly?" For a few seconds, the static drowned out everything, and Owen was just about to cut over to another call when the voice returned. It was crisp and clear, and there was no mistaking her words. "My husband had me killed." In a split second, Owen had cut her off. Cold sweat trickled down his neck. He tried to regain control, but his voice shook like a high-wire act in a stiff breeze. "Sorry, folks. Must be a full moon out tonight. Let's see who's on the next line." Amazingly, the creepy, hoarse voice crackled through his earphones again. "What do you think of a man who would have his own wife killed?" He stabbed his fingers at number 5, and the eerie voice came back, asking the same question. In a desperate frenzy, Owen ran through the whole row of buttons, but Marcia's voice followed him relentlessly. "What do you think of a man who would have his own wife killed?" Finally, he could stand it no longer. When the goading question whined through the last line, he screamed into the mic, "Sure I had you killed, you useless old woman! I paid a fortune to have you dumped over Indian Point just to get rid of that voice, and I'd do it again!" He felt Sam's beefy arms drag him away from the console. "Doc, please!" The engineer managed to get him into the lobby and onto one of the leather couches. "You lie here," he said. "Let me get something to help you relax." In a minute, he was back with some pills and a glass of water. Owen took them eagerly. "I just got back when I heard you yelling at the mic. I knew getting locked up with all those crazy phone calls would get to you sooner or later. You lie back and get some sleep. I'll take care of everything." Owen closed his eyes. The pills did their work quickly. In a few moments, he felt himself tumbling into a soft, velvet darkness. But Marcia's voice still echoed in his brain. "A man who would have his wife killed." When Owen opened his eyes, it was broad daylight. He could see the morning DJ in the booth across from where he lay. A stout man in dire need of a shave was leaning over him. "Let me shake your hand, Dr. Stanford," he said. Owen sat up and took his hand limply. "My wife and I have listened to your show for years. You've certainly helped us over some rough going with your advice." "Thank you very much," Owen mumbled, brushing the hair out of his eyes. "Nice to know there's somebody listening out there." "Oh, they're listening all right. It's a pity I have to arrest one of the few good people on radio today." He showed Owen his detective's badge. All the events of the last few hours flashed in on him. "Listen, if it's about that little joke about my wife—" The detective laughed. "I know you radio guys are a bunch of kooks." Owen joined in with his own nervous laughter. "That's us. A bunch of kooks. You can't take us seriously at all." "That's what I thought at first," said the detective, his expression turning somber. "I just turned on my car radio when that little announcement about dumping your wife came over the air. I was pretty close to Indian Point, so I guess my instincts as a cop led me over there." "And you looked around the highway, but you didn't find her," insisted Owen. "That's right, Dr. Stanford. I couldn't find her anywhere on the highway." The pieces of the puzzle were coming together in Owen's mind. Somehow Marcia had survived, and now she was getting her revenge by making his life a living hell. Still, there was no reason this dumb flatfoot had to know all that. "As I was saying," he said in his most convincing manner, "it was just an on-air joke." The detective was fumbling through his pockets for something. "No, I wouldn't say it was a joke when we have your wife's corpse." "I thought you said you couldn't find her." "On the highway. I was just getting into my car when I happened to look up." "And?" "Most people don't realize the resiliency of the human body, Dr. Stanford. Apparently she bounced quite a bit on the way down. Couldn't believe it myself. But then she was dangling up there among the telephone wires like a boy's lost kite." "Dangling in the telephone wires?" Owen's jaw hung slack, and his eyes had a dazed expression. "Yes, sir," said the detective. "I had to get the phone people out to retrieve the body. Strangest thing I've ever seen." He looked down at the card he had finally found. "Oh, before I forget, you have the right to remain silent."
A Summer Night's Visitor by Gordon A. Reims. The trees were motionless in the misty twilight, as still as though they were part of an indoor stage set. The path through the underbrush had become indistinct, and the growing darkness seemed heavy behind him, almost sinister. He paused. He had a feeling he'd left something back there in the woods in his haste, but whatever it was, it would have to wait until morning. There was something else, too. He wondered if what he thought he'd seen was still there. That strong suggestion of something yellow, something living, moving slowly toward him, far back in the deepening shadows. Was it just an illusion? A trick of the fading light? There seemed nothing there now but silent darkness. He stumbled twice as he moved hurriedly forward again on the dark path, and felt a sense of welcome relief when he came out onto the broad lawn, with the house silhouetted before him against the deepening amber of the western sky. He walked around the dark rectangle of his wife's rose garden to the back entrance, opened the screen door, reached inside, and flicked on both indoor and outdoor lights. A few insects circled around him as he paused at the threshold and looked again toward the darkening woods. It was then that he was sure he saw it once again, just at the point where he had emerged from the woods. That bare flicker of dull yellow, that fleeting suggestion of movement. He suddenly felt the grip of an unaccustomed tightness in his stomach. He lingered in the doorway and watched, waited. Yes, it was definitely there, closer and moving. It was on the lawn. The door light and the fading light from the sky combined to dimly reveal a moving slither of deep gold, a small reptilian head, two glistening beads of eyes. Like some tawny living garden hose, he could see it silently undulating as it moved toward him, directly toward him, just as he thought it had in the woods. Standing still, he watched its progress, sometimes clearly visible, at other times so blurred into the shadow that he was almost convinced he had imagined it. Then he was sure it had reached the rose garden. But it didn't go around the beds of roses and peonies as he had done. It moved straight on into the bed's leafy shadows, noiselessly curving and uncurving. Its course was still straight toward him. He wished for his flashlight, and remembered that it was in the pickup truck parked in the driveway, a little more than 20 yards away. He walked quickly to it, and after fumbling briefly at the cluttered shelf behind the seat, found the object he was seeking. Walking slowly back, he played the flashlight beam at the dark rose bed, and then over the short stretch of lawn between the bed and the door. There was no sign of any creature. His next beam played along the window sills of the house, danced up and down along the wisteria vines, and probed the dark places under the heavier shrubs. Somewhere off in the woods, he could hear an owl's familiar cry. He was a few feet from the back door when he discovered with startling suddenness why he had not yet seen the creature. There it was, entwined around the bracket which held the outdoor light above the back door. Its head was poised just over the entrance like a thick golden knot, and its eyes seemed to be looking straight at him. The entire pose was one of waiting. He'd rather not walk back into the house, not at this door. He headed quickly for the dark area of the front entrance. Flashlight beamed before him. He gained the steps and tried the knob. Locked. He slapped his hands against his pockets. But no, he had no key case with him. Back down the steps and completely around the house in a slow circle, playing the flashlight on lawn and shrubs as he went. When he again reached the back door, the bracket was bare. There was no reptile in sight. Taking a deep breath, he opened the door and stepped quickly inside. Then he closed and latched both screen door and inner door behind him. The house seemed unusually quiet, because Clara wasn't there, of course. He found himself gaping at the pot that hung over the stove, the dish-drying towels on the wooden hanger, the calendar in the corner with its little notes in the margins. He walked into the adjoining study that had once been a dinette, then down 3 steps into the living room, where Clara's array of photographs lined the mantelpiece of the fieldstone fireplace. Each room came to life in turn as his fingers flipped wall switches. Then he returned to the kitchen, opened the refrigerator door, and grasped a container of beer. This was what he needed. This was welcome normality. He opened the container, stepped into the study, and sank into the old leather easy chair.
Almost immediately, he found his attention attracted to the little west window on the wall before him. Was he mistaken, or had he caught a sudden movement in the hemlock branches just outside? He set his beer on a lamp table, stepped to the window, and pulled the shade all the way down. Then he went to each window in all the downstairs rooms, closing those that were open, despite the warmth of the night and the protective presence of screens. When he returned to the study, he was surprised to find that his hand shook slightly as he raised the container of beer. He sat quietly for a few minutes, sipping, but the silence was almost tangible. Restlessly, he left the chair once again, and this time walked to the dark stairwell. Pushing a button to flood the upper hall with light, he began to ascend the stairs. It was as he reached the top step that definite movement caught his eye at the window at the end of the short upper hall. A thin, curving shadow, dark where it was furthest from the window, slightly golden where it caught the light close to the screen. The window was open about 5 inches. He forced himself to walk forward. The curtain had been pushed aside to let in air, and as he approached, he could see all of the snake's form. It seemed at first suspended in air with no visible support, like a ghost or an illusion, curled in half a hoop, with the triangular head looking straight into the hall. Then he realized it was hanging from the support wire which stretched from the outside ledge to the narrow chimney. He slammed the window shut and pulled the curtain across. Through these brief seconds the reptile had been motionless, the yellow, looping cords seeming enormous. He closed all the remaining upstairs windows. The attic? No, he wouldn't worry there. He'd just make sure the attic door itself was firmly closed. He walked into the square front bedroom with its flower-patterned wallpaper. Here the stillness and Clara's absence seemed doubly noticeable. He decided then that he would sleep on the cot in the study. Returning downstairs, he went to the kitchen and stuffed a dish towel into the floor opening around the drain pipe under the sink. He made sure the cellar door was closed. Then he spotted the telephone on its blue kitchen ledge, and a moment later was dialing a number from memory. "Bart, this is Jess. Tell me, did you ever hear of snakes following people?" "You mean like chasing them?" "I've been followed by a snake, Bart, right out of the woods and across the yard. It came after me, all the way to the house. It's been looking in the windows at me. I think it's trying to get in." A brief silence at the other end. "I'll be damned, Jess. Never heard of a snake following anybody. Maybe it has a nest in your foundation or is looking for mice. What kind of snake is it?" "It's golden, Bart. Pure gold in color. As long as a black snake, but pure, smooth gold." "Oh, Jess, there's no such snake around here." Bart's voice was low and relaxed and somehow reassuring. "Blacks and garters, yes, but that's it. Haven't seen a copperhead or a rattler near here since I was a boy. Where'd you say you first saw it?" "On the rocks back there in the woods. I wasn't too sure at first. It seemed to slide off the rocks and come toward me." Bart chuckled. "Hell, it likes you, Jess. You've got a new pet. Anyway, I wouldn't really worry. It'll probably be gone in the morning. Is Clara worried?" "Clara's visiting her sister in Springfield." "So that's why you're scared." Bart laughed again. "Being alone up there by the woods is getting to you." "Don't be ridiculous. But it's damned eerie to have a snake follow you, to actually stalk you. I'm telling you, this one came right to the window and looked straight at me with its beady little eyes." He heard Bart chuckle. "If I didn't know you better, Jess, I'd think you were imagining things. I sure never heard of a snake chasing a man. They usually try to avoid you. Even a rattler will attack only if it thinks it's on the defensive. I wouldn't give it a worry, Jess. It'll be gone in the morning." Replacing the telephone, Jess returned to the leather chair, leaned back, finished his beer, and reflected. His mind drifted to stories of the supernatural, to animals mysteriously guided by villainous minds, to hallucinatory snakes. Something he'd read long ago, perhaps in childhood, crept darkly into his thoughts. The story of a reptile whose mind had been controlled by a departed human spirit. Annoyed at himself, he kicked off his shoes and stretched out tentatively atop the spread on the old cot. The stuffed toy dog from Clara's childhood peered comically down at him from a corner shelf.
Beside it, the old broken cuckoo clock he'd long promised Clara he'd have repaired. He really didn't think he could go to sleep, but he'd give it a try. Perhaps he did sleep briefly. He thought that he finally must have dozed off, for he suddenly awoke from a half-dream with a decided sense of time-lapse and of alarm. He'd heard a sound. It was just a small sound, not alarming in itself, but unusual in the house at night. Because it was different, it brought back all the deeply seated uneasiness. It was just a metallic ping, a muted, gentle metallic contact of some kind. It came, or seemed to come, from the living room. His mind raced over possibilities. A moth or large flying bug striking something metallic. A drop of water hitting a metal utensil. But that would have to be in the kitchen. He lay listening, alert, focusing his mind on the recollection of the sound, straining to hear if it might be repeated. And now there was something else, very faint, very slight. A loose cloth being pulled across a rough wood edge? No, that would likely be his imagination. His thoughts went back to metallic objects. What was metallic in the living room or elsewhere close by? Should he investigate? And then came a familiar creak, much fainter than usual, but familiar. It was the sound made when someone started up the 3 steps to the study from the living room. He sat up on the couch and stared at the stairway opening. He could feel a tingling at the base of his neck. He knew suddenly what the metallic sound had been. It had been made by something striking the andirons that hung in their places at the fireplace. The fireplace! The one possibility he'd failed to foresee, the one opening through which a snake could enter. The creature had been on that chimney support wire outside the upstairs window, and had only to follow it to the chimney itself, and slip down into the fireplace. Now it was undoubtedly mounting the 3 steps. He groped frantically for the light beside the cot. If the snake had crossed that loose board those many seconds ago, it might well be reaching the cot right now. He suddenly recalled reading that some snakes can see animals or people in the dark through heat-sensitive nodes in their foreheads. Flinging his arms out wildly, he struck the lamp, almost knocking it over, but finally found the switch. As light filled the room, he heard car engines. Headlight beams flared across the window. He glanced around him just long enough to make sure there was no snake on the cot or on the immediately adjacent carpet. Then he leapt from the cot. In stockinged feet, but still fully dressed otherwise, he raced into and across the kitchen. In a hasty fumble, he opened inner door and screen door, and ran out onto the cool, damp grass, into the glare of headlights. "There's a snake inside!" he shouted. 2 vehicles were present. One was obviously a police car with its rotating light on the roof and a loud squawk of radio voices. The other was merely represented by bright headlights, glaring out of the dark. "Mr. Sebring?" A heavy, brisk voice. A strong flashlight beam played quickly over him, up and down. Yes, there's a snake in my house." "A snake in your house?" The brisk voice seemed challenging. "Yes, a yellow one. It was trying to get in, and I closed all the windows, but it came down the chimney." "Just like Santa Claus?" Off to one side, another flashlight beam focused briefly on the shrubbery, and then moved to the back door of the house. The figure behind each flashlight was but a vague shadow. "Mr. Sebring," the figure holding the first flashlight lowered it slightly, "I must remind you that you have the right to remain silent. You have the right—" "What do you mean?" A confused and wary tone crept into Jess's voice. "I'm only being chased by a snake." "I'm afraid it's a little more than that, Mr. Sebring," the brisk voice responded. "Incidentally, I'm Sergeant Broussette, Lakeside Station State Police." Every bone and muscle in Jess's body seemed to sag at once. A third figure, more recognizable, now appeared at Jess's side. "I went into the woods after our phone conversation," Bart Clary said in his low, easy voice. "I went up the path with my son. I was curious and concerned. I live near the path, too, you know." He took something from his pocket and held it in front of Jess. "Out there by the rocks, I thought I saw a yellow snake, too. But it was just this, dangling across the rocks. Isn't it Clara's?" The object in his muscular hands was a slender yellow belt. "You left your shovel out there, Mr. Sebring," Sergeant Broussette added in a flat voice. "That's what led us to dig." Jess covered his face with his hands. "Under the stones," Bart said, "we found Clara's dress, and then Clara." "We understood that your wife was to have visited her sister in Springfield," said Sergeant Broussette. "But with Mr. Clary's assistance, we contacted the sister and found this to be untrue." Jess shook his head slowly in the loose grip of his hands. "I didn't mean to kill her," he murmured. "I didn't mean to." The screen door slammed, and the carrier of the second flashlight emerged. "No snake in the house as far as I can see, Sergeant." A few steps from the house, he added, "Oh, and the fireplace flue was closed."
Old Flame by Taylor McCafferty. After a funeral, you're supposed to feel sad, and maybe a little scared after coming face to face with the finality of death and all. I don't think, however, that you're supposed to feel angry, but that's what I feel, all right. Real angry. With nobody left to be mad at anymore. Except maybe Pa. I'm sitting out here on the front porch, and I can hear him real plain in the kitchen, sniffling. Everybody that came by to pay their respects is finally gone, and Pa's out there rattling pots and pans like maybe he's going to make us something to eat. Now that would be a first. Pa cooking. He's just making all that noise so I'll hear him and get up and fix something for us. In a minute he'll be yelling at me, "Ida Sue, ain't it about time for dinner?" How he can even think about eating is beyond me. And all that pan rattling out there sure doesn't cover up his sniffling. I'm trying to keep calm, but that sniffling is a real irritating thing to have to listen to. Because I know Pa's just crying for Janelle. Not for anybody else. Not for me, not Chandler. Just Janelle. I know Pa blames me for all this, too. I can see it in his eyes. And of course I can't forget what he screamed at me that day. I know Pa won't ever admit the part he played in all of this either. After all, he did start it, didn't he? If he hadn't spoilt Janelle so bad, given her everything she ever wanted, maybe things would have been different. And if Pa hadn't ever told us how our mama really died, maybe none of this would have happened. Part of being able to do a thing is believing you can do it, isn't it? And Papa helped me and Janelle with the believing part. He helped us with that real good. I was just 13 the day Pa decided to break the news. Janelle was 14, and if there was such a thing as a line between pretty and beautiful, Janelle had crossed it that year. She made you want to gasp just looking at her. I admit it, back then I couldn't help being jealous of her. Pa had been worshiping at her feet ever since she was a baby. And my mirror plainly told me she had me beat real bad in the looks department. Janelle had long, wavy, chestnut-colored hair, creamy white skin, and big blue eyes with lashes so thick they looked false. At 14, she had the kind of figure grown women envy. I, on the other hand, had the kind of figure they call skinny, and the kind of hair they call dishwater blonde. It was real limp, too, like maybe some of that dishwater had been left in it. It didn't help any either to know that your father plain and simple liked your sister best. Who was it that Pa put his arm around when he was telling us about Mama? Janelle, of course. I was standing right next to him, too, but Pa reached over and pulled Janelle close. "Now, Janelle, Ida Sue," he said, "it's high time you two finally knew about what happened to your mama, and I want to be the one to tell you before you hear it from somebody else." To this day, I'm still not sure why Pa told us. Neither Janelle or I even remembered our mama. She died when I was still a baby. And it wasn't like we still lived in Pigeon Fork where it all happened. We moved from there to Bullet Lick right after Mama died. And nobody here even knew about it. Or if they'd heard about it long ago, they never connected the story to us. Still, Janelle was starting junior high the next week. Maybe Pa was afraid she would look it all up in the high school library. I heard tell that the new library the high school had just built had years of back issues of a dozen Kentucky newspapers. So maybe Pa was worried. Because even though Pigeon Fork was 100 miles away, Mama had made news statewide. I can still remember the way Pa's voice dropped to a whisper when he told us. Like he was talking about something sacred, or maybe something too frightening to talk about out loud. Your Mama was sitting out on the back porch swing, holding her Captain Muffin on her lap. I was in the kitchen right on the other side of the screen door, so I could see her real plain out there, staring straight ahead, swinging back and forth. She was in a snit about something or other. Here Pa's eyes dropped for a second. Even at 13, I could guess what Mama might have been mad about. As far back as I could remember, Pa had been something of a ladies' man. He was real good-looking, dark and slim, and he must have dated every available woman around these parts, and he even dated some that weren't available. Both Janelle and I had heard the gossip about Pa. In a town the size of Bullet Lick, you couldn't keep something like that a secret. Janelle and I exchanged a knowing look before Pa went on. She was just sitting with that dang cat of hers. Then all of a sudden, as sure as I'm sitting here, your mama just burned up. Well, Janelle and I looked at him for a second without saying a word. Then I asked, my voice shaking a little, "What do you mean, burned up?" "I mean, she just caught fire, that's all." Pa's eyes got this haunted look in them. I tried to save her. I ran out there thinking I'd get her to roll on the ground like you're supposed to do. But you couldn't get near her. She was all blue flame. Pa's voice trailed off. Just blue flame is all. Janelle's eyes were even bigger than usual now. She swallowed once and then asked, "Was she sitting by a stove?" Now, you got to understand here that while Janelle may have been heavy on looks, she was a quart low on smarts. Pa was used to it by now, though, because all he did was take a deep breath before he answered her. "I said your ma was out there on the porch, Janelle. There aren't too many stoves out on the porch." Pa's voice was slow and patient. He rubbed his hand over his eyes like he was trying to rub the memory away. That was what was so weird. The fire looked like it was coming from inside her. Janelle's eyes seemed to fill her whole face. Me, I was trying real hard not to smile, because I was thinking, you mean to tell me that all these years we've been told that our mama died in a fire, and now you expect us to believe that Mama was the fire? Right. What happened to the cat? My voice must have sounded a little skeptical because Pa gave me a sharp glance. Now look, little girl, he said, I'm trying to warn you. The same thing happened to that cat as happened to your mama, and I don't want it happening again. Ever. Pa looked away then, scowling. When he spoke again, his voice was real low, almost as if he were talking to himself. You know, that porch swing she was sitting on wasn't even singed, or the floor around them. But your mama, Pa actually shuddered. He got up then, real abrupt. Look, I don't ever want to talk about it again. I felt like you two should know, that's all. Then he went on into the living room and started reading the paper. Like what he'd just told us wasn't anything more interesting than what happened at the church social last week. After Pa went inside, Janelle wrinkled her pretty nose and said, Well, that was a disgusting thing for him to tell us. Yuck! Seeing my big, strong father actually shudder had done a lot to convince me that Pa was telling us the truth. I think he was trying to warn us, I said. About what? I think he was being mean telling us a creepy thing like that. Janelle was pouting by then, so I gave up trying to talk to her. In fact, we didn't talk about it for a long time after that. I thought about it, though, wondering about poor Mama. Sometimes I even cried for her, for that woman I'd never got to know. But every time I'd start to bring it up with Janelle, she'd cut me off with, Look, that's disgusting, okay? And she'd flounce out of the room. The next year, when I started junior high myself, I looked it all up in the library. Sure enough, Mama was written up in a lot of papers. All of them called it the same thing. Spontaneous human combustion. Like the way oily rags catch fire in a shed sometimes. Those newspapers said that there had been quite a few people over the years who died like that. The papers said there's a lot in your body that could catch fire, like fats and oils, phosphorus, stuff like that. After I read all those articles about Mama, it all seemed more real to me. More real and more frightening. I started thinking about it a lot. Thinking about how they say your brain operates by making electrical connections, like tiny sparks in your brain. I figured maybe what happened to Mama was like that. Maybe she got so upset that day that one of those brain sparks got out of control, and it caught her on fire. I tried again to tell Janelle about it, too. We better be careful, I said, because you never can tell. Maybe we're like Mama, and if we get too upset, it could happen to us, too. Janelle looked real pale for a minute. Then she shrugged and tossed her dark curls. Look, our Mama made an ash of herself a long time ago. She smiled at her little joke. It's got nothing to do with us. I tried to make her listen, but she wouldn't hear of it. Eventually, I realized Janelle probably had nothing to worry about anyway, because everything she wanted, she seemed to get. Looking at her perfect face and perfect figure, I decided it was real likely that Janelle might live her whole life and never once get upset. It was me that had to be careful. So I worked on getting to be real easygoing about everything. When I'd forget to do one of my chores, and Janelle would tell Pa, I learned to just keep cool. It got to where I could stand there and have Pa yell at me right in front of Janelle, and I wouldn't feel a thing. Even when Janelle made up stuff that I did, and she'd stand there with that little half-smile on her face all the time Pa was smacking me. Nothing was worth dying over, so I got laid back. After a while, there wasn't anything in the world that I cared about enough to get upset over. Until I met Chandler Ferris. Chandler had just transferred to our high school in my freshman year, and even though he was a year ahead of me, we were assigned to the same study hall. I noticed him the first day he walked in. Chandler wasn't exactly the handsomest guy I'd ever seen, but he had the kind of face you don't get tired of looking at. Blue eyes, freckled nose, easy smile. A shock of sandy hair always falling in his eyes. I guess I was in love the minute I saw him sitting across from me. When he asked me out, I thought I might actually faint from happiness. When he asked me to go steady, I practically did faint. I guess those months I went steady with Chandler were the happiest I've ever known, before or since. Suddenly it didn't matter if the phone rang constantly for Janelle or if Pa practically ignored me or anything else. I had Chandler, and that was all I needed. Oh, I couldn't believe how lucky I was. One night, driving home from the movies in Chandler's old Ford, he kept looking over at me and smiling, and looking over at me and smiling some more. Finally, I said, "What is it?" That's when he told me. "You know what I really like about you?" I shook my head no. It was the truth. I really had no idea. "You're pretty and you don't know it." Oh, I must have turned bright red. Chandler reached over and took my hand. For a minute, we just grinned at each other. "You're real smart, too." Now, I wasn't sure about that either. Oh, I made good grades all right, but if you never went out on dates, and before Chandler I didn't, and then you had a lot of time to study. My grades didn't suffer any when I started dating Chandler either, because Chandler was a real serious student, too. He wanted to be a doctor, so he studied as much as I did. A lot of times we studied together. Janelle used to laugh at us, calling us the bookworms, like it was a dirty word. But that was before Chandler won that award in his junior year. We'd been going together about a year when Chandler got selected something called a President's Scholar. That's a big honor around here. It got Chandler's picture in the paper. It got him a full scholarship at any Kentucky college. And let's face it, it got him Janelle. I'll never forget the expression on Janelle's face while she read about Chandler in the Bullet Lick Gazette. It was like watching a cat read about a mouse. I remember feeling real uneasy watching her face. Pa was impressed with Chandler, too. He took that paper right out of Janelle's hands and said, "This here boy's going to be rich one day. You mark my words, rich." He beamed at me the whole time he was talking. It was probably the first time he'd ever said an approving thing to me. Janelle looked like she'd been slapped. She didn't look any better when Pa went on, "Janelle, you do good to find yourself a catch like Ida Sue has. Somebody who's going to have some money, instead of all those football idiots you're always mooning over." Janelle had just started going steady with yet another football idiot that week. She turned without a word and stomped out of the room. Up to then, Janelle had made it a point not to be around when the drip, that's what she called Chandler, came around. But after that little scene with Pa, she was suddenly hanging all over Chandler the minute he walked in the door. The first time she did it, I got as mad as I could let myself get. "He's mine, Janelle," I told her as soon as Chandler left. Janelle gave me a look that said, "Oh, yeah?" Her mouth said, "All's fair in love and war." And she gave me one of those little half-smiles of hers as she walked away. I watched her, feeling a little sick. And Chandler, poor Chandler, he never knew what hit him. Even today it seems as if one day he was mine, and the next day I walked into the living room and saw them, Janelle and Chandler, wrapped in each other's arms so close they seemed to be one. I'd seen it coming by then, of course. I couldn't help but notice the new dazed look Chandler was wearing lately, or how all of a sudden Janelle seemed to need Chandler's help with every subject she had. I also noticed how Janelle's hand lingered on his when she handed him her school book or got him a Coke. How she was always leaning real close to him so he could smell all that perfume she wore. I could see it happening all right, but I didn't know how to stop it. How could somebody like me fight somebody like Janelle? Chandler and I had been sleeping together for almost 6 months by then, but even in bed with me, Chandler seemed a little distracted. It must have taken Janelle a little time to take Chandler away from me, but it seemed like 15 minutes, max. After I walked in on them that night, I just stood there, not wanting to believe my eyes. For a second, I couldn't breathe. My heart started pounding real funny, and my face got real hot. Janelle and Chandler both started talking at once. Chandler was almost stammering. "Oh, Ida Sue, I'm so sorry. Janelle and I didn't wait around to hear the rest. I just turned and ran upstairs as fast as I could. There I took a long, long shower, standing under the cool water and crying, till finally I was all cried out. Finally I'd washed that awful scene right out of my mind. I never broke down again. After that, when Chandler started coming by to pick up Janelle, I made sure I was out of sight. I still watched him, though, from behind the curtains in my room. Watched him going off with Janelle smiling into her eyes. I wanted to hate him, but I just couldn't. Hating Janelle, however, was real easy. When Chandler went away to Centerville College that next year, I didn't know which hurt the most, seeing him with Janelle or not seeing him at all. Before he left, Chandler and Janelle got engaged. Janelle showed me that diamond ring just like I'd never dated Chandler myself, like he'd always been hers. It was as if she'd put the whole thing out of her mind.
"I think Chandler and I were meant for each other," Janelle told me. She actually told me that.
After Chandler left for college, Janelle moped around the house for about 2 weeks. Pa started complaining weekly about her running up a phone bill calling Chandler long distance. Then, of course, Janelle couldn't sit at home. She started dating other guys. "Janelle, what are you doing? What about Chandler?" I asked her the first time she went flouncing out of the house with some guy she'd met at a restaurant where she'd started working. Janelle looked at me as cool as you please.
"What about him?"
she said. Well, I couldn't think of a thing to say back to her. I just stared at her open-mouthed. She shrugged and smiled that little half-smile of hers.
"Now don't get all uppity with me, Ida Sue. I still love Chandler just like always. He's going to give me everything I've ever wanted. But he wouldn't want me sitting around this house getting bored. There's no harm in me having a little fun."
I had to clench my hands together to keep from slapping her. I thought about telling Chandler, too, but I knew he wouldn't believe me, or else he'd hate me for trying to stir up trouble. So I kept still and waited. That was during my senior year in high school. To keep my cool, I buried myself in my studies. I ended up with straight A's and a full scholarship to any college I wanted. That fall, I decided to go to Centerville College, just like Chandler. I guess in the back of my mind, I knew what I was up to, that what finally happened I'd planned all along. But I told myself that I was going to Centerville just to be near Chandler, that was all. I realized he belonged to Janelle now, but I just wanted to see him again. Nothing more. Just to see him. I think I believe that. I know it never occurred to Janelle I could be going to Centerville because of Chandler. For one thing, Janelle could never think of me as competition. I'd filled out some, and I'd learned to wear makeup right, but Janelle had me beat so long ago, I don't think she even saw me anymore. As a matter of fact, the day before I left, Janelle actually gave me a hug and said, "Now you keep an eye on my man. Make sure he doesn't get away from me." And she laughed like the idea was preposterous. This, even though she herself was dating other people. I ended up in 2 of Chandler's classes, and it seemed as natural a thing in the world that Chandler and I would end up studying together. And even more natural that one night Chandler would lean over and kiss me, just like he used to almost 3 years before. He pulled back right away, and then just stared at me. "You know what's happened, don't you?" Oh, his eyes were so blue. "I've fallen in love with you all over again. I can see now it's you and me. It always has been." Oh, my heart was pounding so hard I could hardly say what had to be said. "But Chandler, what about Janelle?" His face reddened, and he said, "I realize now that was just an infatuation." He looked away and added, his voice real low, "I've been hearing things about Janelle for a long time now. You know how folks in Bullet Lick love to spread bad news." So, he'd heard about Janelle's running around after all. I hadn't had to say a word. "I guess maybe I'm old-fashioned," Chandler went on, "but I need a wife who'll be faithful." He reached over and took my hand. "I need you, Ida Sue. You and I, well, we've got so much in common. We belong together." He ran his hands through his hair and added, "It's going to be hard telling Janelle, but it's got to be done." I started feeling real hot just thinking about it, wondering how Janelle would take it. But Chandler said, "Don't worry. She'll understand. You'll see. She'll realize you and I were meant for each other." Janelle was waiting for Chandler on the front porch when we went home for Christmas that year. When she lifted her hand to wave at him, I could see that diamond on her finger sparkling in the cold winter sun. Janelle's smile faded as soon as she saw me get out of the car, too.
"Why, Ida Sue, I didn't know you were driving back with Chandler. I thought you might take the bus."
Her voice trailed off when she got a good look at our faces. I guess what we had to tell her was written all over them because Janelle's face went chalky white.
"What's going on?"
Her voice went so loud and shrill that it brought Pa to the front door and back of her. Chandler plunged right in, though. "I'm real sorry, Janelle, but I've found out I love Ida Sue here. I always have." He went on, saying how he wouldn't hurt her for the world, but it was surely a lot kinder just to tell her outright than to lead her on. I was watching Janelle's face while Chandler talked. As pale as it was before, it went slowly deep, deep red. "I know you'll wish us well," Chandler finished. I'll never forget what he looked like at that moment. So sweet, so earnest, so sure that this was the best way to handle everything. Janelle looked like she might faint. She swayed on her feet, and Chandler rushed forward to catch her. Janelle started to speak, and for a second not a sound came out of her mouth. Then it was a wail, the wail of an animal wounded and hurting. "No!" That was all she said. But she flung herself at Chandler, wrapped herself around him as if she never meant to let go. I knew right then what was happening. I'd seen her eyes like something was smoldering in them. "Chandler!" I yelled. "Get away from her!" Chandler turned to me, his face registering surprise, and it seemed suddenly as if everything was happening in slow motion. Chandler made a move as if to pull away, but it was already too late. He opened his mouth to scream, and then they were both engulfed by a blue flame that burned and burned and burned, but didn't seem to ignite anything else. Nothing else but my sister and the man I loved. I stood there watching those awful flames, and it felt like a part of me was dying too. Even from where I stood, a good 3 feet away, the heat was so intense I had to step back. I realized dimly that Pa had rushed outside, screaming Janelle's name. Over and over he screamed it until it was just a whimper. Then Pa turned to me. I can't forget what he said. "What have you done?" I keep hearing Pa say that over and over. It's hard to believe sitting out here that this is where Janelle and Chandler both died. Out here on this very porch. Floorboards aren't even singed. Pa is still whimpering in the kitchen, still sniffling. I heard Pa telling everybody at the funeral and all those reporters that showed up that what happened was a terrible accident. But Janelle didn't mean to do what she did, and that she sure didn't mean to take Chandler with her. I know that's a lie. If Pa had seen what I saw that day, he'd know it too. In the midst of the flames, for just a moment, I could still see Janelle's face. She was looking straight at me and smiling that little half smile. Until the flames rose so high, so hot, you couldn't see anything. Only her and Chandler's shapes, looking as if they were whirling in the blaze. Janelle took Chandler from me on purpose. The only way she could anymore. It makes me so mad to think about it. But there's no one left to be mad at anymore. Nobody left to vent this awful anger on. I'm sitting out here, trying to cool down, trying to put it all into perspective. But the whole thing makes me so horribly mad. And Pa's sniffling out there keeps making me madder. And madder. I feel like I could just explode.
Magic Nights by James R. Petrin. Being on a lower branch of the tree, Tom could see only the electric yellow patch of wall over the curtain and a shadow drifting behind it. Ralph had a higher and better view, 1 foot on Tom's shoulder, stretched out along his own branch like a cat. "The body," said Ralph, "must be old Mrs. Sharp, his mother. He's cut her all to pieces in the sink, and now he's stuffing the parts into his pockets. Why would he do that? Let me look." But Ralph didn't budge. Tom could only watch the shadow, a movement of purple behind the screen. For a moment, he had in his mind's eye a vision of Mr. Sharp, the druggist, in his wheezing, pink-faced jollity, stooping over his kitchen sink, red to the elbows, tucking body parts into his shirt and whistling. Why'd he do it? Tom persisted. He was a visiting city cousin, and ignorant. "She was a witch," said Ralph. They rustled down out of the owl-shadowed midnight leaves, wrist and elbows, all tree sap and scratches. Ralph had torn his trousers. "I'll say a dog did it." "It was black," Tom agreed. "And as big as me. Now, come on. I'll show you the place where they all dance naked." The two boys ran into the magic night, sailing their bodies like hawks over the gray grass, past the shadowed houses with their windows lit like eyes, past the school, past the church, white and straight, burning like a chimney lamp against the black New England woods. They jumped a low iron fence and walked among graves. "This is creepy," Tom said. "No, it isn't," Ralph replied. "It's safe. They don't bury witches in holy ground." They sprang away on rubber soles, soft as cats. But in the woods, at the end of the thin path that wound like a vein near the heap of rusting moon-shadowed cars, a dewy meadow was deserted. No one was naked. No one danced. They ran home. It was Ralph's home, actually. Ralph's and Aunt Mary's and Uncle Harry's. The boys leapt the 3-porch stairs and crashed through the door into the kitchen, and Aunt Mary wrestled Ralph out of his trousers, scolding all dogs and boys, then gave them ice cream to eat in the dark on the front porch swing. "See that house?" said Ralph, pointing his spoon. "It's got bats." "Where's Uncle?" "He'll be late. He sees women. Mom's boiling." Tom was doubtful. Aunt Mary might be warm, but never hot. She was short and full and comfortable, like a pillow, soft as the cobwebs she pretended to find with her quick whisking broom, warm as the afghans she wove around every hard surface and sharp edge in the house. "Do they fight?" Tom whispered. "Dad does," Ralph said. "By himself." He pointed to a lamplit tree, bent at its waist like an old crooked man, with a load of leaves on his back. "They hanged 7 ladies there once." Then he added with reluctance, as though it pained him to admit it, "It was a mistake. None of them were witches." They went to bed. Hours later, Tom awoke to hear Ralph's ragged breath and Uncle downstairs thundering things and roaring so that the wall shook the book out of the casement to let the window fall down. Uncle might have been storming about the house all alone. Aunt Mary never made a peep. Perhaps he'd killed her. It was a terrible and wonderful thing to hear a drunken man roar in the night. Tom and Ralph were up with the sun. "Do you think we'll still be going?" whispered Tom. "After last night?" "Oh, sure. We never miss cider day's fair." There was the belling of pots downstairs, the thump of the freezer door, Aunt Mary in her knitted slippers sculpting breakfast out of frozen blocks, and Uncle in the bathroom, whistling and yodeling under the shower. The boys ate like wolves. Uncle with laughs, growls, and winks, Aunt Mary with smiles so hard and thin you could have picked them up and whittled them down with a knife. They escaped to the car with Uncle, couldn't get away quick enough from the sudden Eskimo Arctic of Aunt Mary's kitchen and her bleak living room tundra. Apple cider day. The boys held their breath. Marching bands, sack races, cotton candy and frowning clowns, 3 darts for a quarter, hit a balloon, win a prize, spill a fat lady into water with a baseball, toss a small ring around a large bottle, a large ball through a small hole, take any prize from this shelf, see the largest horse almost in the world, see a chicken spell its name, see old frowning farmers with thick silent wives, girls thin as celery clutching coins, and an enormous plush bear on a tiny boy. Roller coasters, mirror mazes, candy apples, wishing wells. "But first," said Uncle, "I got to make a stop." Ralph winked. Uncle swerved the car in at Ashton's music school, lessons $10 per hour. The boys craned their necks. They could just see the top of the Ferris wheel flying its candy cars above the barber-shop roof. A huge voice woofed in the distance, loudspeakering them suddenly on a gust of music. Uncle gave them each $10, and Tom nearly mentioned the $10 Aunt Mary had already given them before Ralph kicked him. "You can walk from here," Uncle began, but the boys were already running. "Meet you later," he echoed his voice down the empty street after them. From the top of the stairs, Alice Ashton spotted Harold Martin's raw-boned body through the shears and tingled. She drew the door open in her grandest manner, and he smiled his lopsided grin. He seemed slightly embarrassed. "Is Laureen here, Ash?" She pulled him gently in. "Laureen is upstairs practicing her lesson, and I won't have you interrupting her." It was an elegant hall, she liked to think, cool and shaded. A wide mahogany staircase, a grandmother clock doling out time with easy hollow ticks, deep varnished silences. She knew Harold Martins from school days. She sometimes thought she might have married him, if not for that prissy Mary Smith. What he'd ever seen in her. And now he was chasing the college girls. Laureen James could be his daughter. Well, he'd soon learn Alice Ashton had other plans for him. A bone-chilling moan issued from an upstairs room. Alice lifted herself under her white shift and said sweetly, "She just murders the saxophone, doesn't she?" She led him into the drawing room, shutting out the sound with tall sliding doors. She was careful to pause under the huge stuffed glaring owl. She liked to have it behind her, wings half lifted, settling as though to seize her and carry her off. She felt it gave her an air of menace. "You will have a whiskey." He sat on the chair as though he might break it. "Just a short one. I brought the boys up to the fair." His eyes were fixed on the ceiling. You'd have thought his gaze could penetrate to Laureen James through the plaster. Alice poured a strong one for him, and a weak one for herself, as she considered how to approach her subject. "Bob Cole is leaving our group," she said finally. He nodded. He might not have heard her. His thoughts were elsewhere in the house. She went on. "He took your place a year ago. Now he's been transferred out west. So we're left with our 13 again, Harold." Harold said nothing. "We want you to come back." Harold Martin smiled. He rumpled his hair before he spoke, a mannerism that had always attracted her. A little boy in a man's body. "I got no time anymore for that witchcraft stuff." "You used to have time for it." She hesitated, then added, "And for me." But his eyes were still on the ceiling. "The coven thing was fun," he said. For a while. But maybe I got tired of it." He hesitated and then added, "Or maybe you just started getting too mean, Ash. At the beginning, you said we'd only do white magic." She could have reached out and clawed him. "We aren't an entertainment," she snapped, "to amuse farm boys. What we do is serious business. Sometimes hard things must be done, punishments." She shook her head at him. "I'm sorry now I let you go. I should never have let you get away from us. You took an oath." "Bob Cole took an oath." "That's different. He's not leaving by choice." She tightened her voice. "We must have our 13. Harold Martins still had his smile, but it was wilting. "I got no time, Ash. You can find somebody else." "No." She stood up. "I want you." She floated across the thick, silent carpet until she was standing over him. There was an especially loud wail from the room upstairs. Even the sliding doors couldn't keep it out. She took his face in her hands. "I want you." Steam tractors. The boys lusted after them. Bonfired, black-smoked, and silver-breathed, blaring their dinosaur whistles and steel-cleating the ground, the monsters pistoned by, crewed by snow-haired, tobacco-faced men who winked and waved. Ralph had spent 9 and Tom 8 of the $10 Uncle Harry had given them. They'd been whirled, swung, tossed, and dropped, cotton-candied, orange-popped, and red-sticked licoriced. Tom had ridden a horse, Ralph a camel. Neither of them had yet been properly frightened. They had reached the end of the midway and stood at the entrance to the House of Horrors. Ralph fingered his money. "I bet it's a rip-off." "Look at the pictures," Tom urged. "There's a vampire." "Wax," said Ralph. "There's skeletons." "Sticks." "And ghosts." "Sheets." Tom sighed. "Well," he said, "there's a witch." "Okay," said Ralph. Up a stair, through a curtain, blackness. "Holy cow," said Ralph. "It's darker than the crawl hole under the back of the church." Down a ramp, round a corner, antenna fingertips quivering like 2 human ants in a tunnel, moving with short, nervous steps. Pow! A ghost on a stick exploded, shrieking, "Yeah!" The boys grabbed one another and jumped away into a skeleton that plunged on a wire. "Help!" They blundered round a corner. An air blast zapped them, gusting them up to a snap-open curtain and a screeching fanged face, and a bat danced on their heads. They came to the witch under a blue light, gasping. She was seated in the wall on a chair, dried up and twisted, a crone. There was a peaked cap, broken-ended, a parsnip nose, taloned, broom-strangling fingers, ankles sprouting thin as weeds out of buckled shoes, sunken cheeks, bulbous eyes, warts, and a black cat perched on her shoulder as though on a fence. "There's dust on that cat," whispered Ralph. The witch flew at them, screaming. They fled out into the sun. The midway had not changed. There was still the pressing, laughing, sun-tanned people, the rides flying against the blue sky, and the ticket seller eyeing them impassively. They stopped to collect themselves and walked off with dignity. "That didn't even look like a witch," said Ralph. "What does a witch look like, then?" "Like Miss Ashton." And suddenly, here was Uncle Harry to end their afternoon, clapping their shoulders, joking and jostling them into the car, singing them back to the house, where Aunt Mary took them over with a dark look and a jar of liniment. "They're burnt to a crisp," she grumbled softly at Uncle. "Haven't you any sense at all?" Alice Ashton was ready when Lorene James came down the stairs, one final wounded saxophone wail still shivering the music-room dust. It had been close. She had moved quickly in the basement room, a lamp in the magic circle, a consecration of salt and water, a summoning of the spirits. Through the circle, she channeled the powers of the 12, not nearly as powerful as with the 13, of course, which is why she had decided to use her strongest spell, and to choose from her most precious ingredients. Hemlock, belladonna, arsenic, cyanide. She had meted her selection carefully from the little pressed tin boxes and pestled them into a tincture. She was waiting in the hall when Lorene came smiling down the stairs. "I don't know where the afternoon went, Miss Ashton. You didn't come back, and I just kept on with page 17 trying to get it right. I'm so sorry, my dear, but someone came to the door, and I could not shake them off. Next lesson free, all right?" She stopped Lorene at the bottom of the stair. "Just let me have a look at that instrument, dear. It's making the most unusual sounds, and I'm sure it isn't you." She had the case sprung in a moment, and the mouthpiece in her hand. "Well, no wonder. Just look at this reed. It must be replaced. I suspected as much and got another one out. Let me slip it in for you. There. Just try that as soon as you get home." "You shouldn't bother, Miss Ashton." "Oh, but I feel responsible. After all, Ashton Music is lending you this instrument, and even the best musicians can't get music out of a bad reed." The door banged shut on Lorene James, and silence fell upon the house like a dark, settling dust. Alice watched the girl hurry down the walk, too full of life, too topped up with the stupid, naive cheerfulness of youth, bouncing bright hair, tight jeans, quick white runners flashing in the sun, and swinging at her thigh went the battered music case, gleaming on the inside with the grin of keys and buttons, and a lurking charm ready to lash out and strike like a bite. "A night visit," Ralph said. "We got to do it. It's the only way to enjoy a fair." He added, as if it were a reason in itself, "We still got the money Mom gave us." The weather had turned cooler. Gray clouds tumbled over the town. They sat on the vacation-cleared steps of the school and chewed gum. "Anyway," he continued, "I want to go through that haunted house again. I want to figure out how some of those spooky things work." "I already figured them out," Tom said. "I think there must be treadles, some sort of switches under the floor that make things pop out at you." "You know that for sure?" "Not for sure." "Then it's settled. We go back to see if you're right, and we go tonight, okay?" But Tom was staring hard at an elderly woman toiling by on the far side of the street with two sagging shopping bags that might have held bricks. He sucked in his breath. "Say, Ralph, isn't that old Mrs. Scharf, the drugstore man's mother?" Ralph jawed at his gum. "Yeah, it is." The woman struggled on down the street. "But I thought she was dead that night in the window. You said Mr. Scharf was cutting her up." "He was." There was a silence. "But there she is," Tom said flatly. Ralph shrugged. "I told you she was a witch, didn't I? I bet now she's cut him up, and she's carting him away in those bags." He snapped his gum, and his eyes glazed over. "Just think," he said, "how great it'll be on the Midway after dark. Everything lit up like fireworks, everything bigger, brighter, busier. That's the time to take in the House of Horrors, with the dark breathing after you in those passages like a murderer. We got to go. We got to do it, Tom." Tom hugged his knees. "Aunt Mary's dead set against it." Ralph snorted. "Mom worries too much. She figures we'd get robbed or beat up or something. Night is when the city folks come out here. But geez, who'd ever catch us if we had half a step head start? We're going, and that's all there is to it." "If Aunt Mary finds out, she'll only find out if she looks in my room, and she never does that." He pointed. "See the old geezer there? He once served 20 years for murder. Killed a taxman with a hammer." They found Uncle in the backyard when they got home, sitting on a box, staring at the ground. He didn't even look up. Aunt Mary explained it to them, whispering grimly over a pie crust she was rolling out on the table. They looked at one another, then slipped up to Ralph's room, stocking-footed, and sat on the edge of the bed. "I don't get it," said Tom. "Is this Lorene James related to your dad? A cousin or something?" Ralph laughed thinly. "A kissing cousin, maybe. Don't you know anything about grown-ups?" Tom thought. Then a sense of awareness slowly gripped him. "You mean Uncle Harry and that girl?" "I told you he saw girls, didn't I?" Tom whistled. "Your poor dad. Your poor Mom." "Tonight," Ralph said, back in his own world. "We're going tonight." Alice Ashton slammed down the phone and felt her blood pressure shoot up a pound. Where was the saxophone mouthpiece? The instrument itself lay here before her, a long flash of gold in the velvet bed of its case, without a mouthpiece. She had called the James house, waited on the phone while Mrs. James sent her boys scouring the place, had listened to the thump and bump of feet on the stairs while Mrs. James sobbed into the phone about her little darling. Tiresome woman. Didn't she know about Harold Martin's and the dark of the Beacon Theater? Or the car in the night on the River Road Hill? The town cats knew more than she did. The mouthpiece, where was it? It still carried its spell. She had to find it. She scowled up at the owl and its bat-spread wings, looking as though it knew precisely where to look, but was being silent just out of spite. And another thing, she had better not wait. Now was the time to talk Harold Martins back into the fold. Now was when he'd be needing someone most. She dialed. But it wasn't Harold who answered. It was Mary. For a brief moment, Alice was tempted to hang up the receiver without a word. She'd done that before. But now, with the success of her spell, she felt bold. Mary's voice came feather-soft and paper-thin over the wires. A delicate voice, but one with a made-up mind behind it. "No, Alice, I most certainly will not let you speak to my husband. But I only want to console him, Mary, over his loss. He's got me for that." A so-soft voice, like dandelion seeds floating. "You, dear," Alice could not restrain her contempt. "He hasn't needed you for a long time, has he? Let me speak to him." "I won't." Alice felt her patience beginning to curdle. "You're very bold now, aren't you, dear, now that Harold doesn't have his little Laureen to run to?" He didn't have her anyway. A soft voice, but chill, like settling crystals of ice. "Laureen James visited me yesterday. She had just come from your place. She had her music case with her." Alice froze. "She sat right here on the sofa and told me how foolish she had been, and how sorry she was, and how she had decided to stay away from Harold for good. She was crying, and I believe she was truly sorry, and that she meant every word of it." Alice was dying to ask about the music case. "Any real woman," she said, "would have slapped the little tramp silly, coming to you as bold as that." "Any woman like you is what you mean, Alice. But I'm not like you. I don't pounce on people with my claws out." "So," Alice said, "she told you all this nonsense, grabbed her music case, and ran out of the door. Is that it?" "Not at all. In fact, though, I don't expect you to believe it, I think we became friends. We had a nice talk. I asked her about her school, about her music. She even took her saxophone out of its case to show me." Alice sucked in her breath. "I asked her to play something for me." Alice pushed the phone into her ear so hard she hurt her head. "She played some scales. She said it was all she had learned from you. I wasn't surprised about that. Then we heard a car out back. I said it was Harold getting home, and she ran out of the front door and disappeared. Then later, I heard how she... And she left the instrument case?" "Yes, and that's all you're worried about, isn't it? She left it, and I sent it straight to her house." "You should have sent it to me. It was mine. And there's a part missing, too, the mouthpiece. What did you do with it?" Mary Martin's voice got even softer now, and chillier. "Is that so important? Don't you care a thing about that poor girl? She was your student, after all." There was a pause. Then Mary said, "I did find a little part afterwards. It's in my purse. I'm going to send it along to Mrs. James." A hunger ran away with Alice's voice. "You send it to me, do you hear? It's mine." She was sorry immediately. She could almost hear the suspicions crackle in the mousy little head at the end of the line. Finally, Mary said carefully, "I don't give anything to anyone that can't say please." "But it's mine. You give it to me, Mary Martins. If you don't—" Mary's voice came smiling down the line. "You'll what? Cast a spell on me?" So, Mary knew about the coven. Of course, Harold would have told her. He was sworn to secrecy, and he had told her. But since she knew, I will cast a spell on you, Mary Martins. I'll—" "Do it, then." Mary's voice crisped softly in the earpiece. "Go on. I dare you." The challenge was infuriating, like being pricked by a needle. Alice replied with her lips drawn over her teeth, slinking her voice like a cat. "You can pretend to be brave, Mary Martins, but what about your family, your boy?" "You don't scare me at all with your make-believe," snapped Mary right back. I know you too well, Alice Ashton. There's more bitch than witch about you." The phone banged down in Alice's ear. Alice stood with the receiver still in her hand, stunned. It wasn't the language. She used that herself when it suited. But coming from Goody Two-Shoes Martin's, that one tame word was like a slap in the face. Damn the woman! Alice slammed her own phone down so hard the bells rang. Her mind was already made up. She knew exactly what she was going to do, and no power on earth was going to keep her from it. She stamped through the kitchen to the basement door, pounded down the stairs to her very private room, which she unlocked with a key on a thong around her neck. Mary Martins had scoffed at the 13. Mary Martins must have her comeuppance. The little room was a very special place. There was no other like it in 100 miles. Alice had attended every Sabbath in the area for the last 10 years, and she ought to know. In the center of the floor, beautifully painted by her own hand, was her circle, 9 feet in diameter, marked with signs of the Kabbalah, a lens to focus her power, a protection from the demons whom she often summoned to help in her work. From a deal table, she took an incense burner, a container of salt, a chalice of water, and a dagger. All of this she took into the circle and placed on a tiny low altar. Then she knelt in the circle herself and began her chant. She exhaled. The blood tingled in her fingers. So, now it was Mary Martins who stood in the way of the 13. She placed her dagger in the very center of the circle and lifted her hands. Mary Martins sat in her little parlor with her hands clenched tight in her lap. She sat without stirring, her slow breaths lifting her blouse. A beam of sunlight edged along the floor, trailing gold, orange-brown, then fading gray. Shadows gathered in the corners of the room. Shadows. She raised herself finally, creaking the chair and the floor, crossing the room to the hall closet, where she took from her purse a small object carefully wrapped in a plastic bread bag. This she studied carefully, thinking. Suddenly, she recoiled as though the thing had bitten her. It fell to the floor. She watched it where it lay, while a new comprehension came slowly over her. She picked up the object gingerly, returned it to her purse, went into the kitchen, and thoroughly washed her hands. Now to the door to snap-bang the locks into place. Now along the hall past the empty kitchen to rattle the chain onto the back door. The old stair-boards groaned her up to the second floor. She looked in on Harold, sprawled on his bed, fully dressed, drawing his breath in deep, heavy gasps, as though the very act of sleep exhausted him. Mary crossed the hall to her own room, then paused, went 3 more steps down the narrow passage, and peeked into the boys' room. An empty bed. She stood for several long moments with her hand on the doorknob, then turned and went with certain quick steps back down the stairs. She put on her coat, took her purse, let herself out of the house, carefully locking the door behind her. "Isn't this more like it, though?" Ralph had to shout his words over the high-flying wind. The Ferris wheel had stopped. They swayed in a car at the top of the fair, the midway lights strewn below them like a handful of Christmas, the stars in the huge black bowl of the sky floating over the town like dust. Magic lay all around. "I can see the post office," Ralph howled. Tom pointed. "And the church. And the cars on First Street." The wind shrieked and tilted them. "And I can see your mom," said Tom. He gripped Ralph's arm. "That is Aunt Mary, isn't it?" An unmistakable, plump female figure was hurrying towards the fairgrounds, along the street, bowing against the night breeze, a purse like a sack gripped under one arm. Tom felt Ralph stiffen. "Geez, you're right. That is Mom. She must have checked my room." He bit his lip. "We got to get away. We can't let her catch us here. We got to get back to the house, get right to bed, tell her in the morning we just went out for a walk because we couldn't sleep." Tom broke in. "And who's that coming along behind her?" Ralph looked. "That's Miss Ashton, the music teacher. Hey, did you see that?" For a second, Aunt Mary had paused, turned quickly to glance behind her, and at that exact moment, Miss Ashton had faded into a shop doorway. The huge wheel lurched back to life and began rolling them downwards. "There's something weird going on," said Tom. He looked at Ralph, then at the ground, lifting splashes of light up to them out of the dark. "Maybe we ought to find out what it is." "How?" Their car was on the ground, the operator tipping them out of their seats like delicate baggage. Tom led the way to the back of a hot dog stand. "Aunt Mary's got to walk right by here if she comes in the gate." Ralph swayed and caught at a rope, tying a tent to a spike. He was still looking back at the Ferris wheel. It was moving again, drifting against the black sky like a burning circle. "Here she comes," hissed Tom, flattening himself against the stand. They had hidden themselves just in time. Aunt Mary was approaching quickly along the midway, raking the squealing rides and the ticket-clutching lineups with her sharp eyes. They let her pass. Ralph would have stepped out after her, but Tom held him back. "Look!" It was Miss Ashton. She had come into the fairground, too, right on the heels of Aunt Mary. She took no interest at all in the sights around her, but walked with a purposeful, stalking stride. She kept one hand pressed to her side, as though she were easing a pain. Tom said, "That Miss Ashton is following your mother. Why would she do that?" Ralph shrugged. "Let's find out." This was a new and stimulating game. Tom could see his own excitement glowing in Ralph's eyes. It was like secret agents. Now in the color and lights, in the crazy sounds, the pressing, laughing, fun-seeking people, they were suddenly caught up in something bigger than a stolen night out. They were putting one foot into the half-open doorway of an adult world. Anything might happen. They expected it. Along they went, Aunt Mary leading, scouring everything to her right and left, Miss Ashton hanging back, the one hand curiously pressed to her side, then the two boys rubber-treading the packed earth, melting along in the wake of the women like two cats. "Mom's looking for us," Ralph said. "That's plain." "Yeah," said Tom, "but what's Miss Ashton looking for?" "She's got something in her hand, some old roll of paper or something." "Yeah, or cloth." Aunt Mary stopped. Miss Ashton stopped. The boys stopped. Aunt Mary studied the whirl-away, plunging and hurtling its screaming prisoners in flashing steel cages through the waves of exploding music and the booming, "Want to go faster?" voice. The prisoners squealed, "Yes, no," and the machine roared and flung them through the night wind, howling. Aunt Mary trotted on, then stopped again, this time to scrutinize the Dodgem car drivers. "Hey," said Ralph, "Miss Ashton's moving up. Look." Miss Ashton seemed to have changed her strategy. No longer simply hanging back and following, she was creeping closer to Aunt Mary, taking advantage of the crowd. The Dodgem cars crashed and buzzed, showering blue sparks. Miss Ashton was 3, now 2, now 1 person away, when Aunt Mary spun on her heel and hurried on. "I don't like it," said Tom. "Something awful's going to happen. We got to warn your mom." Ralph wasn't convinced. "Wait a bit. Could be nothing. We can't give ourselves away for no reason. We can still beat Mom back home when she's ready to leave. I don't want to be grounded the rest of the summer if I can help it." The crowd was thinning rapidly, diluted by the chill and the lateness of the hour. When they reached the House of Horrors, the once bustling midway was reduced to small knots of stragglers. Aunt Mary hurried faster, as if the House of Horrors was what she had been looking for all along. She paid her money and went straight in. "She must have heard us talking about that place," Ralph said. "She figures we might be in there." He sucked in his breath. "And look at her." Miss Ashton had also bought a ticket, and was hurrying after Aunt Mary. She had discarded the cloth wrapping. There was a wink of light in her hand. Both boys jumped forward at once. The idea of soft, vulnerable Aunt Mary being stalked in the batten monster darkness was too much for them. They paid. They slipped through the entrance and stopped. There was someone standing a few feet ahead of them in the darkness, breathing. They could sense it. And somewhere ahead, a whisper of footsteps. Farther on, something slammed like a door. There was a scream of wild laughter. Tom felt his heart jump under his collar and stay there. Up ahead, Aunt Mary must have just met the ghost. He felt the presence in front of them shift away into the passage, and again, farther on, a snap of wires like a tangling clothesline, a rattle like clothespins, the skeleton. Tom searched for Ralph's sleeve, plucked at it, whispering, You stick to Miss Ashton. I'll slip by her and warn Aunt Mary." He was moving before Ralph could argue. Tom was glad of his rubber soles. The presence ahead of him could not move so silently, but went with the creak of wood floor and shoe leather, and the tapping point force of a narrow heel. But the passage was narrow. It would not be an easy matter to slip by anyone unnoticed. He formed his plan as he crept along. The screaming face ought to be next. He recalled it being lit with a flash of the brightest light, a light that could give him away. But if he kept to his right, flat up against the passage wall, he ought to be out of its beam, and Miss Ashton would probably reel back momentarily blinded. In that instant, after the light went out, with her pressed against the back of the passage, he might be able to duck by. Air blasted his feet. He heard a cry right in front of him. He was so close to Miss Ashton, the air jet must have triggered only once for both of them. Forward, forward, easing along the floor of the passage, keeping as close as he dared to the presence before him. Soon he thought, at any moment now, the screaming face will pounce. The flooring creaked. There was a sigh of a feathered breath. Then, bam! The blinding light, the face, the wild scream. Tom threw himself against the right-hand wall, twisting, darting silently by and on into the passage. He went quickly now. Aunt Mary would be just ahead. Bats danced in his hair. Not far now. The witch was close, the blue glow of her light just a few steps away. There was a shifting blackness in front of him. "Aunt Mary," he whispered. He caught up with her at the witch. "It's me, Tom." There was a scent of lilacs, a brush of cloth. He took Aunt Mary's sleeve. "Watch out for that Miss Ashton. She—" A hand gripped his wrist like a clamp. A sharp breath hissed between thin, hard lips, and a terrible fear leapt within him as the blue light revealed the cold, hard features of Miss Ashton, where Aunt Mary's kindly face should be. She growled like a cat. "You little—" Her hand flew up. Cold steel flashed blue in the witch's light. Tom's response was a reflex action. He reached out his foot and stamped where the witch's treadle ought to be. The witch screeched and leapt. Tom yanked away. Miss Ashton went twisting down, hit the wall, then the floor, groaned, and then sighed. The sirening and strobing ambulance seemed a commonplace thing on the Midway, its usual thunder stolen by the surroundings. The attendants, white-capped and jacketed, bundled their load out of the house of horrors. The mound under the sheet seemed strangely small and fragile for the once bristling Miss Ashton. There were fragments of conversation. "Must have fallen right on her own knife. What was she doing in there?" The boys stood on either side of Aunt Mary like guards. Tom tugged at her arm. "How did Miss Ashton get ahead of you in the passage?" Her nervous voice pattered like a soft rain. "I knew she was following me. That's why I ducked into that haunted place, to get away. As soon as I got inside the entrance, I stood back to let her go by me. I can take care of myself." There was a multitude of questions. The doctor was saying to a policeman, "I don't understand it. You can see that she fell on the knife. Her hand was still gripping it. But it was a shallow wound, not normally a fatal one." Aunt Mary touched his sleeve. "You'd better have a close look at that blade. I think you'll find something on it, something bad, some coating that shouldn't be there." She handed over the saxophone mouthpiece, which she had in her purse, still carefully wrapped in its plastic bag. "And you'd better have a look at this, too." She paused a moment and added, "You all know me. You know where you can find me. My legs are shaking. I think I need a good lie-down." The policeman hesitated, then slowly nodded. They walked Aunt Mary home. And it was strange, Tom thought, how little magic there was in the streets this night at 2:00 in the morning.
The Dear Departed by Dan Crawford. I always knew her footstep. Or actually, because there was carpet on the floor, I knew the sound of her legs and skirt as she walked. So I knew she was there long before she said anything.
"Rebecca?"
she said gently.
"Rebecca, are you there?"
"Yes, Aunt Rose," I called back, loud enough for her to hear it. "Yes." I turned around and saw her standing by the butcher block table. She was wearing her gray outfit, and both pairs of glasses hung around her neck. She looked vaguely worried, as she almost always did.
"I don't like to disturb you, dear," she said, "but there seems to be someone in my room. I don't mean that. I mean there seems to have been someone in my room. Things have been moved around and so on. Would you come and look at it?"
I didn't get up. "I know Aunt Rose," I said. "She, works here. She did move some things around, but she told me about them, and I checked to be sure she didn't take anything."
"Oh,"
she said, not quite reassured.
"She does? I see. Yes. Are you sure?"
"Yes, Aunt Rose," I told her.
My, she replied. "Works here, you say?"
She seemed to be fading a little, and I hoped she would continue before Paul heard me. Of course I had to speak up so she could make out what I was saying, and also, of course, Paul came bursting in from his workroom. "Are you here again?" he demanded, seeing his aunt. "Go back where you belong." Fortunately, he was too far away for her to make out the words, but she could see he was upset. She waved her hand fondly, smiled at me to show that we shared our trials in dealing with this lovable but not entirely sensible child, and vanished. "Damn it all, what did she want this time?" he demanded, coming up the hall. "Someone's been in her room moving things," I answered demurely. "I should think so," he snapped, unmoved. Shammy had the misfortune to amble into the room at this point. "And as for you," Paul began, turning on him. "Oh, don't pick on the dog," I ordered. I do try to be soothing and understanding, but I'm new at it. "Oh, it's a dog, is it?" Paul demanded, watching the little black poodle through narrowed eyes. Shammy was headed for the butcher-block table. "I thought it was a large cockroach." Shammy raised a leg, and Paul stooped down like an avenging Jupiter and dealt him a hard slap just behind the head. "And if he doesn't mind his manners, I'm going to get a cat." Shammy rolled back, looked up at Paul, and wagged his tail. He didn't know what the game was, but he was willing to play. Paul snarled and stormed back to his workroom. Shammy is Aunt Rose's dog. Paul and I have a basic disagreement about him. I think he's cute. Paul thinks he should be run through a sausage grinder. Of course, he's known Shammy longer than I have. His Aunt Rose had no children and had lived with Paul and Shammy for 12 years. Then she died. I'm not quite sure what happened after that. Paul, who is up on this sort of thing, says that she was so vague by that time that she didn't know quite what to do. Unable to realize that she was dead and buried, she had simply returned to the apartment to live as she always had. In the ensuing year, he had attended a comic book convention, where I met him, and so on and so forth. The courtship was fairly normal, thank you, once I learned that on his system of values I was only 9.5 out of a possible 10. Copper-bound books on magic and mysticism came in at 9.65. We were married, and we had just about reached the point at which he trusted me to go into his workroom, escorted by him. It is full of braziers and incense and elderly books, and has a not-quite-clean look about it. I do not offer criticism. I have to work up another 0.15 of a point first. I had known I was marrying a sorcerer, of course. Paul was too much of a gentleman to let me find it out after the wedding. He even let me watch as he conjured up our rings out of a smoking bowl of water and rue. He said it came from Atlantis, and the rings were Atlantean work, too. I believed him. At least I couldn't see Hong Kong stamped on them anywhere, and mine never turned my finger green or orange or any other color. And he had no objection to being married like normal people, with a regular license and church ceremony. I had visions of having to tell my parents to meet us in the cemetery at midnight and bring a shovel. So I was really not overly upset to find that our bedroom was haunted by Aunt Rose. She was a dear departed soul, and she had a tendency to appear during daylight, just before lunch, and just after supper. This made things easy to arrange. But Paul found her infuriating, and her little dog, too. I had the presence of mind not to ask why he didn't use his magic to banish her. He had explained to me while we were dating that a magician can't do everything he wants to, even if he has the power. I accepted that. It is rather a mature adult concept, and I'm proud of it. A child assumes that an adult can do lots of things, but just won't, out of sheerly perverse contrariness. As a child, I had planned to move to a jungle, live in a tree, wear leopard skins, and be a friend to all animals. I don't know where I thought I'd get the leopard skins. When I got older, I learned about malaria, and passports, and snakes, and so on. Nothing, of course, was stopping me from going off to a jungle. I had just noticed numerous logical reasons not to do so. I think it works that way with magic. Shammy barked and ran to the door. "Hush!" ordered Paul. Shammy, of course, did not hush, particularly when someone began to smack the knocker against the door. The sound always drove the little dog frantic. "I said hush!" bellowed Paul, emerging from the workroom again. He swatted the dog away from the door. "This is for me, I think," he said, turning the bolt. "Yes," he went on, pulling the door open. "Dr. Young, is it?" I went over as the tall man with the briefcase entered. Shammy was still barking. This was unusual, since Shammy seemed to feel that once a person had actually entered the apartment, his responsibility had ended. I grabbed him up, carried him to the bathroom, dropped him into the tub, which was too tall for him to jump out of, and shut the door. When I got back, Paul was chatting with his visitor. "This is Dr. Young," he told me. "My wife, Rebecca. Dr. Young is what you might call an exorcist. I called to see if he could help with Aunt Rose." "I thought exorcists only dealt with evil spirits," I said. "Okay," answered Paul. "Then don't call him an exorcist." "Perhaps it would be better to call me a removal expert," said Dr. Young, smiling. "I take unwanted ghosts away from the spots they haunt. Or if you want to, you can call me a ghostbuster, if you promise not to sing." He smiled to show his teeth. I didn't like him. I can't say why. His suit was clean and pressed, much nicer than any of Paul's suits. His hair was neat and unobjectionable. His teeth were white and even, but not white and even enough to be obnoxious. His briefcase had a battered, comfortable look about it, and his shoes were neat but not newly shined. He wore a plain blue tie with a simple tie clasp. He looked like 1,000 people you meet on the street. But there was something about him that made me think of frog claws. "Now what I do, Mr. Sangsocks," he said, turning back to Paul, "is less a matter of exorcism than simple removal. I just take the ghost that's causing you trouble, get it into a bottle like this." He opened the briefcase and brought out a small green bottle about the size of one of those screw-top bottles that come in 6-packs. "And take it away with me." "What do you do with it then?" I inquired. "Why, that's a little difficult to explain," said Dr. Young, smiling again. "And not really any of our business," Paul broke in. "I'll show you the room where she appears most often." He took Dr. Young by the elbow and hurried him toward the bedroom with the bottle. I turned to follow, but stopped and looked back at Dr. Young's briefcase. I am not nosy as a rule, I tell myself, but if I'm going to be a good wife to a sorcerer, I ought to take every opportunity to learn, I told myself. So, making sure that Dr. Young and Paul were out of the hall, I knelt quickly and unlatched the briefcase. I didn't learn much there. There were 2 long rods, a bundle of leaves, and 3 neat rows of empty bottles held into place with straps. I was reaching down to open a bottle to see if it was really empty, when I was suddenly hit by one of those fierce, hot itches. You know the kind. It strikes in the middle of your back when you're eating out at a classy restaurant, and you sit there and wiggle because you were taught never to scratch in public. This itch hit me in 5 places at once, most of them unmentionable. At the same time, I was suddenly aware of a pressing need to run into the bathroom. I snapped the briefcase shut and made a quick dash. My hand was on the zipper when I noticed Shammy. I was always the self-conscious type, and though aware of the foolishness of it, after all, I always watched him when he was doing it, I lifted him out of the tub and shut him outside. I should have known that he would head straight for his usual spot under the bed. There was a tumult of shouting and barking, and, as I expected, a cry of, "Rebecca!" I zipped up and ran out. Dr. Young had a small portable brazier set up, and several leaves dangled from his hands as he tried to hop out of reach. Shammy was running around his feet, nipping at magic ankles in green socks. "I'll get him," I called, noticing that Paul had picked up a large bookend. "He usually doesn't behave this way, Doctor." "Could you take him, too?" Paul demanded as I swooped down and just missed the little beggar. Don't bother with anything mystic, just stuff him in a bottle." "Be careful, Mrs. Sangsock," said the doctor. "Don't spill—" I think he was going to say don't spill the brazier, because before he got to the, that's what I did. Whatever was in the thing splashed away from me, burning into the carpet, searing the doctor's suit and sizzling among Shammy's matted hair. The doctor and Shammy howled alike. Paul said something not quite nice. I said something similar but less arcane. Acrid smoke filled the room, and Paul said something I didn't follow. A breeze came up. The windows were closed, and the smoke vanished. With it, apparently, went Dr. Young, the brazier, and Shammy. A large chunk of the carpet seemed to have been bitten away, too. "Rats!" said Paul. I looked around the room, not seeing much. I'm sorry," I said. Paul came across the room and put his arms around me. "It isn't your fault," he said, in what for Paul is a gentle voice. "It was that damn—" "Paul?" inquired a soft tone. Paul froze in position, took a deep breath, and turned around. He did not shout, which showed marvelous control, but every word was a separate bark. "What do you want, Aunt Rose?" She understood that he was vexed about something and stepped back. "Are you busy?" she asked. "I don't want to bother you if you're busy." Paul took another long breath. "No, Aunt Rose," he said. "What is it?" "I can't find little Shammy," she told him. "Have you seen him?" I would not have blamed Paul at all for what I could tell he was about to say. Before he could say it, a little phantom ran up by Aunt Rose's feet and rubbed its head on her ankle. It was Shammy, of course. A slightly different Shammy. He wasn't as gray as he had been, and his hair was less matted and tangled. His eyes were bright, and his tongue pink and cheerful. "There you are, little Shammy," she said, bending over to pick him up. "Good little Shammy." When she touched him, the little black dog jumped away from her. "Where are you going, Shammy?" she demanded. "Where are you? Come back here, baby, come back." But he had vanished. She looked at us. "Now he's gone off again," she said. "Do you see him?" "No," said Paul. I pulled away from him and ran to the closet. "Here, Aunt Rose," I said, handing her a little chain. "You'd better put his leash on him before he gets in someone's way." She took it from me. "Oh, yes," she said. She was suddenly cheerful with something to do. "Yes, yes, I will. I'll find him." She turned away from us and disappeared. We haven't seen her since that day. We hope, in fact, we believe that she has at last gone to where little dogs are free to bark. What became of Dr. Young? Doesn't really interest me.
The House on Cedar Hill by David Kaufman. If you turned left from the main highway about a dozen miles before you came to Garlock's Bend and went up through the thick woods on the gently rising cobblestone road for another 2 miles, you'd come to a clearing and to an impressively long row of tall cedars, a handsome sight indeed against the sky, dark green swaying against dark blue. And from there, you'd see my grandmother's house high on the hill beyond. My grandmother's house. That house of all houses, scene of my best memories and of my worst. I suspect that the cobblestones might be gone now, and if they are, lost to local patios or to highway technology, that's a shame, because at least to me in my youth, they were old and honest and reassuring. And I suspect the cedars are gone too, those tall, lovely things. But I'm willing to wager that my grandmother's house is still there, high on that green hill. I'm not certain of it because I've not gone back there, and I don't think I could ever bring myself to go back. But I have an unhappy feeling that the awful house is still there, austere and imposing against the sky. I used to visit there often for a week or two in the summertime when I was a boy, and once I took great delight in spending the whole of a summer at that house. I cared very much for both my grandparents, and how I loved my grandmother, and how she dominated everyone around her, She cooked for us, she cleaned for us, she laughed and told us all to be good. "Are you reading your Bible, Howard?" she'd invariably ask at dinner the first evening each time I arrived to spend a vacation with her. It was a ritual she relished. Very grave she was, and I dared not even smile as I replied. "Yes, Grandma," I'd answer, nervously kicking my heels on the rung of my chair. My answer always appeared to please her, although I expect she knew I was being at least slightly extravagant. Yet somehow I always managed that, "Yes, Grandma." All the house was well known to us. We were free to roam through the whole of it, all the long hallways and as many of the side rooms as we liked, enjoying, cherishing even, the yellowed wallpaper, the ponderous dark woodwork, and the old bookcases of dusty books with strange and quaint titles. The house was what used to be called a plank house. It was essentially square, but there was an addition on the back side of it, the north side on the high slope of the hill, away from the road. The addition was square also, with just one window on the second floor, and although the builder tried, I'm certain, the siding of the addition did not match the original siding of the house. The effect was one of disharmony, and it diminished somewhat the elegance of the building, and even the aesthetics of the whole farm. The addition itself I always looked upon as curious. Even its origin was peculiar. Simply put, there never seemed to be a need for it. The house was quite large, perhaps a dozen rooms, and besides my grandparents, there was only Luther, their helper. My father long before had left the farm, and so there seemed no reason for it. I remember my father once on a visit speaking somewhat sternly to my grandmother about the addition, about its extravagance, when I first began to spend vacations there. It had been put up just before my first summer with them. "Well," she said, looking very serious, "we finally needed it." And after a long pause, "We really did." Even as a youngster, I thought it strange that so late in their lives they felt the need to build an addition onto the house. But I concluded that it was their business, and I was eager and fickle, and quickly forgot about it. Because my grandfather was not a well man, my grandmother kept a hired hand, Luther, who had been with them for years. His health, in truth, was not much better than my grandfather's. But once I heard my grandmother tell my father that old Luther had been around for so long that she could just not bear to let him go, that in truth she really needed him. And so, each with his best effort, the three of them accomplished what none could do alone, and if not excelling, they at least kept the farm in a reasonable state of repair. On those early visits to the farm, I became quite the charge of Luther. I must confess that I loved the fact that he took so keen an interest in me, and my vacations were all the more pleasurable because of him. I really do believe to this day that I cared for him almost as much as I did for my grandfather, who seemed to me then so often distant, and even coldly unresponsive to me. Crotchety old Luther, how I loved him. He taught me about farming. He hobbled along beside me in the woods, my favorite of reasons for going to the farm in the summer, and he saw that I learned all manner of interesting lore about the various trees and animals we encountered. When I visited my grandparents, I was many times the host of children from neighboring farmhouses. Often, as I have related, we roamed about the ponderous old house, playing pirates, hide-and-seek, or some other children's game. So I came to know all of that house quite well. And towards the end, I began to have the strangest feeling about it. I began to feel that somehow the house was much larger on the outside than it was on the inside. I know how peculiar that must sound, and at first I dismissed the idea as silly. But little by little, as I played in the house, especially during that last summer, the idea, which earlier had hardly mattered, took shape and began to grow, and soon I became obsessed with it. I didn't speak of it to anyone, but I began to roam the house with a purpose. I counted rooms. I stepped off distances, figured east and west, and soon I was certain. The house was larger on the outside than could ever be accounted for by knowing it internally. Initially, although the idea fascinated me, I thought it only strangely odd, more perplexing than frightening, and in an effort to put it all right, I settled somehow upon the belief that the disparity of size related in some fashion to the addition on the back. As I said, the thought came without any fear. At the start, it was not much more than a puzzle or a game to me, but as my last visit wore on, I began to be compulsive. I began to feel that I had to solve the riddle. I had to find out about the disparity of size. I had, of course, only a boy's power of deduction, but I was so familiar with the house and its layout that I was able by the last few days of that vacation to conclude that indeed it was the addition. Not only that, but also that I had in my ramblings never been in the addition of the house. I had for several years felt I had the run of the whole house, yet there could be no doubt I had never been in the addition. Then I was really puzzled. I decided at last to discuss the whole thing with Luther. I discounted my grandmother for fear she'd be distressed and think me somehow prying and ungrateful. My grandfather, I was sorry to note, was usually not altogether coherent. His mind was going, and I found myself strangely afraid of him, even at times repelled by him. And so the questions fell to Luther. We were in the spring house one afternoon churning butter. "Luther," I said, "may I ask you a question?" He grunted. Then he nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said softly, stolid, and tobacco-smelling, and somehow very satisfying to be near. "Were you here the summer they built the addition to the house?" "Uh-huh," he said, looking up carefully. He spoke with a thick Pennsylvania Dutch accent. He nodded and then poured more milk into the churn. "That was many years ago now." Somehow my heart fluttered a bit as I said the words, "Why is it so hidden?" I hesitated. "I mean, it has to be some sort of secret. I've never been in the addition. Have you?" He stood quite still, staring at me, the saddest look wiping over his face. I couldn't tell what he was thinking, but finally he shrugged, waved me out of the spring house with a petulant hand, and told me to put it out of my mind. He seemed a little cool to me for the next few days, and once he declined when I wanted to go walking with him. He gave me no real reason, just said that he didn't want to go. I must confess that his refusal both hurt and puzzled me, because I felt so very close to him. I didn't want to displease him, but there it was, and I was too embarrassed to ask him what was wrong between us. I knew it had something to do with the addition, but that was all. I remember vividly some parts of all this. For example, as I look back, I have the distinct impression that by the evening before my last day, because I was so upset by the whole affair with Luther, and because my very simple and innocent question to him had upset him so, I went to bed quite soon after supper, sorry that I'd hurt him, and more afraid than not of what I could not say. And no matter my grandmother's cajoling me to stay up for my last evening with her, tempting me even with the promise of homemade ice cream. But I wanted no company. I wanted no ice cream. What I wanted was to be alone, to have the whole ugly thing go away, to be forgiven my transgression, whatever that transgression was. And I felt that if I slept, and slept long enough perhaps, it would all come right by the time I awakened and left for my home the next day. But I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I lay awake for a very long time that night, an awful feeling of foreboding and dread seeming to slip over my body and cover me like a heavy blanket, an ugly oppression that I couldn't explain. I remember that the night was very hot, the heavy damp air somehow adding to my depression. And I remember tying the whole business to the addition, the somehow awful addition that I cared about only because it had spoiled things between Luther and me. I wished I'd never seen it or asked about it. It was the addition that had caused my troubles. It had to be. And then as I lay there, another idea came to me, astounding in its clarity and in its implications. It was a kind of epiphany, somehow making more intense the ominous and dreadful feelings I could not cast off. It suddenly seemed so obvious. I couldn't think why it had not occurred to me before. In my searches of the house, I had paid no attention whatever to the cellar. I can't believe that even now. But although I'd been in the cellar often, I'd not gone down there in search of the entrance to the addition. Could it be down there? It had to be that, I concluded. It had to be. I flushed with the sudden excitement of it. And it all seemed so logical and yet somehow so elusive. And then, just as suddenly, I began to be quite frightened. The cellar seemed a damp, dark place to me, full of hidden nooks and ugly pipes of all sorts and sizes. But that, in truth,
was not what made me fearful. It was that the entrance, if down there, was hidden, and that made no sense to me at all. We are, I suspect, inordinately fearful of what we don't understand, and I could not begin to understand something so bizarre as that. What possible reason, I wondered, could my grandparents, the kindest and most innocent of people, have for hiding a large portion of their house and in secreting the entrance? That was what frightened me. I lay there confused and perplexed. I had not loved the addition. I had in fact come to hate it. But there could be no reason that I could define why the only door to the place was in the cellar. If again, it was in the cellar. Why would they build it that way? Why? Over and over these thoughts swirled in my mind. I may have cried over all this, but I can't now be certain of anything except my extreme agitation. Finally, my mind awhirl and my heart thumping, I felt compelled to know once for always. I had to know. If they found me out of bed and were angry, if they hated me even, for some reason unknown to me, I was determined to know. It was as if the addition were nagging at me, pulling at me. This was a serious headful of stuff for a young boy. I think I may have been 12. But a decision is a decision, and after what seemed to me to have been hours and hours, I know it had to be well past midnight by that time, I could lie in bed no longer. I just had to try once more to find the elusive entrance. I would go down into the cellar. Indeed, I was drawn there. I have, for some time, been convinced of that. The bed I lay in was quite old. It was full of groanings and squeaks, and once I finally decided, I eased out of it so carefully in that darkness that had anyone seen me, he would have been certain that I was in a still position. So slowly did I move. I wanted no sound. I wanted no one to stop me. And so I had to be stealthy, as distasteful and frightening as that was to me. I moved to my bedroom door, and again, fear of being caught, my motivation. I moved so slowly that I was certain I did not seem to move at all. I inched the door open, eased past it, and closed it ever so carefully behind me. I can't say how long that took. It seemed to me to be forever, and I remember feeling so tense I could hardly close the door. But because action is better than inaction, I felt a sense of exhilaration also. I stood immobile in the dark hallway. In my bedroom, a little light from the night sky had come through the window and had enabled me to see. Now in the hallway I was engulfed in darkness. The doors to each room were closed, and there was no light at all. The orange, tear-shaped bulb that usually glowed softly in the long hallway was not on. It was my grandmother's habit to turn it off when she was certain everyone had settled for the night. So I knew that everyone was in bed, and I could only hope that they were asleep and wouldn't hear me. I thought of going back. I thought desperately of that. But now, frightened as I was also as if possessed. It was as if someone or something were pulling me forward. I stood for some moments, girding myself for what I had to do. I remembered reading once, probably in some boyhood mystery story, that if one wishes to move down a hallway without being heard, he must carefully walk as close to the wall as he physically can, thus avoiding the creaks of the wooden floorboards. And so I eased forward, my body trembling in fear, my fingers sliding timidly along the wall before me, feeling carefully for bedroom doors and for the top of the stairwell to the kitchen below. After again what seemed to me to be hours, I stood at the top step. I stood there immobile, my heart pounding, and then with great resolve, I eased down the stairs so slowly. Down the stairs I moved, terrified at each creak of the old wood, but I felt drawn on. I know I was drawn on. I caught my breath and stopped. I was so frantic, and I'd worked myself into such a state with my wild imaginings that I was suddenly certain that I heard movement above me and behind me on the stairs. I was certain that someone was there, certain that someone was following. I wanted to scream. I wanted to scream and run, but I forced myself to remain quiet. I stood there, trembling and listening, and I couldn't hear anything but the heavy thumping of my heart and the silence of the night roaring at me. Again I waited. Minutes passed. Only that awful quiet.
When I regained control of myself, convinced now that I had imagined the noise and that I was indeed alone, I moved down again slowly, down the steps and across the dark kitchen to the cellar door. How long all of this took, I can't say with any certainty. It may have been about 10 minutes or an hour. The dark was complete, and I'd gotten myself so agitated that I was a poor judge of anything except my fear, so I can't say how long that dreadful journey took. But at last, I found myself at the cellar door. I opened the door very slowly, eased past it, and closed it just as slowly. I stood for more long minutes. My heart was still pounding, and my upper lip was clammy cold. But whatever my emotional state, I was also determined to know the answer. I had to know it, and slowly I eased down into the dank smells of the dark cellar. I think, in truth, that I wasn't quite so stealthy going down those old steps as I might have been. Somehow the closed cellar door made me feel less frightened. I still felt the compulsion, but I suppose I reasoned that I would not be heard by anyone sleeping 2 whole floors above, and that although I was still agitated with each step downwards, I became less so, and by the time I reached the bottom and stood in the total darkness so complete it necessitated the utmost care and movement, I had nevertheless resolved to switch on the cellar light. I stood at the bottom for just a few more seconds, making certain where it was I wanted to go, and then I inched forward slowly, 1 foot barely before the other, in what I hoped was the easy arc that would bring me to the pull chain of the cellar light. And then, oh God, I stopped, petrified with fear. I heard it again. Although I couldn't see the cellar door, I was terrified that someone was there, someone was following me, and I heard the door latch shut. I was certain of it then. I couldn't stop myself. "Who's there?" I cried out. "Who's that, Grandma?" I shuddered, all in a panic. "Is that you?" There was no sound, nothing, only that same slamming of my heart. I thought for certain that I was going to faint, or at least I was going to fall down from fear. But as before in the stairwell, there was then only utter stillness. I waited for more long minutes, but all the sound that I heard, or thought I heard, however slight, I could account for. There was no human sound. Of that I became convinced. Still, I waited. I began to get my imagination under control again. Why, I reasoned, would someone who followed me not just switch on the light and confront me directly about what I was doing out of bed, especially at that hour of the morning? It was I, after all, not anyone else, who was being secretive. And so, as I stood there, thus did I once again, with compulsive logic, conclude that no one was above me on the steps. I moved forward again, very slowly. As I fumbled around in the darkness looking for the light chain, I bumped into a table, and, reaching out to steady myself, I grasped a small flashlight. There was a piece of luck. There was a piece of luck indeed. It felt strangely cool and good to me, and the familiarity of a little thing like a flashlight in all that darkness gave me no little comfort. When I tried the thing, it lit but dimly, but it was enough. It was enough to calm me, enough to bring me back to the reality of where I was, enough for me to see what there was to see. I was, after all, and once again I realized it, only in my grandmother's cellar. It was a familiar enough sight, and I was reassured. I aimed the flashlight back towards the cellar steps. There was no one there. Dim light or no, I could see that. No one. So I had twice been mistaken. Twice I had let my imagination get the better of me. Slowly I aimed the dim light around the cellar, wanting to be absolutely certain that I was alone. I could make out no one in the long shadows, nor anything unusual at all, and I decided quickly not to turn on the cellar bulb. There was no need of it, now that I had the flashlight, and the darkness tempted me with a sense of its security, a sense that, in the dark at least, I would not be discovered. I flashed the light a third time slowly all around me, to convince myself that there was no one. There was not. I was alone. Calm now, I came round once again to my reason for being down there, and I began by deciding which wall of the cellar I might start with, where I might find, if indeed there was one, the entrance to the addition, and to what was inside. Actually, I found it more quickly than I thought I would. It was behind the pantry.
a large closet that my grandmother had filled with quarts of canned fruit from the farm. The pantry, that gateway to a lifetime of anguish and heartache, stood in the darkest corner of the cellar, sufficiently away from the north wall for a person to move or crawl behind it. I was in awe of my find. Even in my wildest imaginings, I could find no excuse for a secret entrance. At worst, I had expected a bolted door on a wall. It could hardly be more secret, however. Drawn by a fear almost sentient, I think I even had hoped I would find no entrance at all, hoped I could find nothing and could go back upstairs. My grandparents, to be honest, seemed at least to me to be the most open of people. They had nothing to hide, I was certain. They were such good, clean, decent folks, and very religious. There was no doubt of any of that. But before me was the entrance, and it was secreted, hidden behind a large pantry, and no one but my grandparents had built the addition. There was something to explain. And then I remembered suddenly that my grandmother had said to my father some years before, "Well," she had murmured, "we finally needed it." Immediately, I was struck by the irony, the bizarreness, the very macabre nature of it all. There it was before me, nagging at me, pulling at me, almost literally, behind the large wooden pantry, a pantry full of innocuous canned fruit. It was nothing more than a rough hole in the stones of the wall, perhaps no larger than 3 feet by 3 feet. Incredibly, there was no door, no barrier of any kind, barring access to what lay beyond. In the darkness and dankness of the cellar, I huddled before the opening with hardly space for my shoulders between the wall and the pantry itself. As I crouched there, bent over as if I might have been in prayer, straining with the flashlight to see what I could see inside, I became aware of an odor, a dank, putrid odor coming from the hole before me. I had the sudden urge to vomit, but I knew that the time had come, and so I waddled clumsily through the small hole and went down on my hands and knees and worked my way forward for a few feet. Once I felt I was through, I tried to stand, but all I got for my effort was a crack on the head. I was not in a room at all, as I'd hoped, but in a sort of tunnel. The flashlight provided almost no light now because it was fading. The batteries were nearly dead. I strained to see just a few inches in front of me, and all around me now the awful, rotten odor. I felt for the perimeters of my space as best I could. I was in a tunnel, the walls of which felt smooth and cold and wet. They were disgusting to the touch, and the tunnel was so confining I began to be claustrophobic. I switched off the flashlight to conserve what little power there was left in it, and I knew that for the first time in my life what it must be like to be blind, to know total darkness. I began to be truly frightened. But for me, there was now no going back. Still on my hands and knees, my body bumping along the slimy, wet walls of the tunnel, revolted by the smell I can only describe as like that of rotten eggs, I inched forward slowly, as best I could in my agitated state. Almost immediately, I sensed that I was moving not on the level, but downhill, down a grade, as I worked my way forward. The tunnel seemed to me to grow somehow smaller, more confining, and the way more difficult. The stench was almost overpowering now, rotten eggs and sulfur. And soon I was fairly certain that I was not headed for the addition, or that I'd missed another entrance to it. Indeed, I had already crawled along many times the length of the house. I was going down, deeper and deeper into the hillside. The rancid air was becoming warmer also, warmer and more putrid. I can't now say what it was that compelled me to move on, why I didn't turn back and flee as best I might out of that long, black, hideous tunnel, back to the pantry and the familiar darkness of my grandmother's cellar. Something was pulling me on, deeper and deeper, but I was afraid to think what it was. I wish I'd gone back at that last moment. I wish I'd been able to pull away and run, but I could not. I wish all of that desperately, but I did not retreat, and it's now too late. I thought I heard noises in the tunnel behind me again, but the flashlight was too weak to reveal anything or anyone. It was of no use at all now. I threw it to the ground in disgust, and thus I was doomed to darkness. I crawled on and down. And still I heard the noise behind me. "Who's there?" I whispered. The loudness of my voice surprised me in that awful gulf of silence. I had barely spoken, but my voice seemed to roar. There was no answer. What happened next happened so quickly that I can only hope to relate all of it correctly. I began crawling forward in earnest now, more rapidly, frantically almost. I'm not certain, but I should guess I'd been drawn on into the tunnel some 50 or perhaps 100 yards. It was as if I had no control over my body, as if something was actually pulling me faster and faster into that black and eldritch nothingness, into the fetid air, into what I did not know, nor could I ever have guessed. And then the growing heat and the awful odor suddenly got so much worse that although I wanted to go on, even felt compelled to go on, I was forced to stop, still on hands and knees, and I could crawl no farther. I knelt there, hunched over, panting, exhausted, searing pains slashing at my arms and legs like knives. There was an awful rushing sound in my head. I was certain that I could not last long, hunched over like that, one large mass of fear and anguish. I began sobbing uncontrollably, but I just could not move. I was immobile, frightened beyond movement. I crouched there, urged forward, but unable to move, unable to think. And then, from down the tunnel, far down the tunnel, in front of me, I barely caught the sound of a heavy, labored breathing. Not human, not possibly human at all, but long and low and incredibly raspy. And the sound grew, and then the noise of movement, heavy movement, slow and casual, coming towards me from below. It was a thrashing, heaving sound, and the air of the tunnel, that awful fetid air, was coming at me as if the body or thing or whatever it was filled the tunnel and thrust the hot, stinking air towards me like a piston might. And the sounds grew louder and louder, the crashing sounds of a heavy body smashing against the sides of the tunnel, followed by the low, inhuman keening of timeless doom and anguish. It seemed to stop suddenly, this thing, as if it had just confronted me, as if it were surprised or suspicious or puzzled. I seemed to sense it there. I sensed something at least, a mass blacker than black, just in front of me. But in truth, I couldn't see or breathe or think or even scream. I was reduced to a mass of terror. And the last thing I remember was its inhuman wail of rage, and at the same instant, someone from behind me, thrusting me violently to the floor of the tunnel, and stumbling desperately over me to get between me and the thing, whatever it was. Then another outraged, horrid wail, and then a human scream of terror, and the sounds of rending flesh. And then I lost it all. I shall never forget those sounds. Never. I wish I might before I die, but I can't forget. I cannot forget. Those are the essentials of my story. I've held the whole of it inside me all my life. No one believed me then. My parents, even my own parents, when they heard, did not believe me. They consoled me. They humored me for a time while I was still abed, but in the end, they did not believe me. I think that I was perhaps an embarrassment to them. I think it was that. So in short order, I stopped relating my tale. I felt they wished it so, wished for my silence, especially my father. How I ached for his understanding, but he never again seemed to be there for me. And the questions remain, so many questions, questions that I have asked myself in anguish 1,000 times. How, for example, did I get from the darkness of that awful tunnel to my home, where I woke up at the last? And who was it got me out of that tunnel itself? The final thing I remembered was that hideous, agonized scream of pain, and the next I knew, I was looking up at the concerned face of my father. Memory may have softened, but I do believe he had the saddest, most helpless look I have ever seen on a man's face. And to this day, I wonder if, in the conversations that followed, he dared tell me all of what was in his mind. What did he know? What was he not telling? I remember that in our discourses I learned that some days had passed. What, I wonder now, as I wondered most of my life, what happened to me in those few days? especially those first hours after I fainted away. My father asked me in the early moments when I woke at home what I remembered, and I could tell him nothing. Nothing, at least, that he seemed to find acceptable to hear. When, in fact, I began to describe what I did know, what I remembered, the fetid air, the awful stench, the horrid keening of whatever unearthly thing was in front of me, and especially that scream of agony, my father did not seem to wish to hear. He became very vague and distant, and said that what I needed was rest. What I needed was rest, he said, and all would come round right. When I told him that what started the whole thing was that I had only wished to find the door to the addition of my grandmother's house, that I, in fact, felt compelled to, that it seemed as time went on that I couldn't stop myself, he mumbled something about not being foolish. He insisted that we both had been in there dozens of times, that my grandmother entertained there often, and when he got that look again, I knew that I was to stop talking. I knew what that look meant. I couldn't understand why he didn't wish to refer to the addition, because even in my confused state it was clear to me that it, or the entrance to it, was the cause of all the difficulty. And, contrary to what my father had said, we indeed had not ever been in the addition. Rather, I was under it. I was in the tunnel, and someone had gotten me out and saved me. My father had said that not only were my hands and knees torn and bloody, from crawling, he supposed, but my side also, as if someone had dragged me quite far and quite abruptly. But he would speak about none of it, not a word. And then I learned the reason for his reticence. One afternoon he came to me and sat on the edge of my bed. He looked inexpressibly sad, and after some moments quietly said, "Howard, it's time for you to know. I think. You're well enough now. I think you are." He hesitated for some moments, looking down at the sheets. "Your grandfather is dead." So that was it. It was my grandfather who died, who threw me to the ground and was torn asunder. He had given his life to save me. I had assumed it was Luther, although I'd never had the courage to ask because of my father's vagueness and surly attitude. And I felt crushed by the knowledge, guilty and crushed for the awful slight I had shown my grandfather, who had obviously loved me and cared for me far more than I had ever loved him. How I must have hurt him when on those vacations I avoided him in favor of Luther. "What?" I managed. "How?" "He died in his sleep that same night," my father said. "His old heart gave out, Howard." I started to say something, to protest that I knew how he had died, and it was not by any means a heart attack. Could they not tell that? But he interrupted, as if he somehow wanted to get something said before I spoke. "I didn't see him. Your grandmother had him taken away immediately to be cremated. It was what he wanted," she said. She said that they had discussed it many times before. I was speechless, confused and speechless. Yet whatever my agitated state, I was reasonable enough to know that my grandfather had died a far different and more hideous death than by a heart attack. I was certain of it. But suddenly, as I looked at my father, and as I thought of some of the things he'd said, how he had tried to steer our conversations away from my version of what had happened, how distant he was with me when I came home, I somehow didn't wish to try to share any of that with him. I'd grown afraid of him. I suddenly didn't wish to share my experiences any longer with anyone. I knew then that it was my lot to be forever alone. And so, the addition. What was the addition? A question to be asked. I've never been in it, I do swear that, and must conclude I do not know where the entrance is. Perhaps farther along in the tunnel. That is what frightens me now. Perhaps I was mistaken about how far forward I had crawled in all that heat and blackness, and I had not yet reached the entrance upwards. My grandfather died in my place. That I do know. It wasn't Luther, as I had concluded in those first few days of consciousness at home. My grandfather had followed me. Why he had, why he didn't stop me, what things he might have known, I shall never have the answer to any of those questions. It was Luther and my grandmother, then, who pulled me from the tunnel. It had to be them.
And to do that, they must have known all about it. They must have known about the thing, too. And why and how they knew of my presence there that night is something I'd rather not think about. They somehow disposed of my grandfather's body, if there was anybody to dispose of. Perhaps, and can I really be thinking this, they had come down to dispose of my body. I never saw either of them again. Several times my father told me of my grandmother's great concern for me, for my welfare, and he said that she hoped desperately I'd visit again one day. But always I became so agitated that he soon stopped suggesting it. It must have hurt him very much, because, after all, she was his mother. But always I felt that perhaps there were other, more cogent reasons for his inclinations. In time, we never spoke of her or the farm, and, God forgive me, I never quite felt the same about or quite trusted my father again. I was afraid to trust him. He knew something. I know he knew something. And so, there it is. As I look back, I must conclude that I was never the same person after that horrid incident. I became a recluse, what some would call a hopeless eccentric. I had, in time, all my father's money, and so it wasn't necessary for me ever to be employed. I traveled to strange places. I read extensively. I wondered. But I never found any answers. In time, I became the frightened, distorted old man I am now, waiting. Did they want me that night? Did they, in fact, do something to me that changed me forever? Why have I always, in all the years that followed, felt myself the outsider, felt different from all others I have come in contact with? I swear that I hear strange sounds, see things when I know nothing is there. But in the end, I can deal with all that. Soon, in my ultimate sadness and the pathetic destiny that comes to each of us, I'll be free of the consummate agony which has been mine. But there is something other that haunts me now, that terrifies me for the very world, and about which I am helpless, 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 and can do nothing. Years have passed, years of fear, of depression, of final despair. My father is dead, and my grandmother and Luther also are long gone from the earth. But there was a thing, an evil, foul-smelling, loathsome, other-world thing, come from someplace beyond someplace. And there still remains the question of questions. Where is it? Where is the thing now?
Out of Touch by Lynn Peters. There was just a slice of moon suspended in a cloudless indigo sky that Friday night, and enough of a chill in the air to remind me that winter and its endless boredom would soon be settling in. It was a night made to be taken advantage of, a night for making memories to be tucked carefully away inside my mental scrapbook, to be relived later when the plummeting temperatures of winter's icy grasp would make staying indoors a matter of necessity rather than one of choice. Time was I wouldn't have thought much of having the freedom to enjoy such a night. I would have stepped out into that crisp, clean air and gone off with the gang, unappreciative of being allowed to do so. That was before Dad's accident on Clover Hill Curve, before Mom's grief over his death made a virtual prisoner of me. She believed, actually believed, if she'd kept him from leaving home that night, he would not have died. Mom was wrong, of course. Everyone from the widow Hanley down the street to Aunt Mildred in Toronto tried talking some sense into her, but nothing anyone said could convince her. Mom was determined to see to it that no freak accident would come to claim me, too, and beyond attending school, I was forbidden to leave the house without her. In the beginning, I tried to be patient and understanding with her fears. As time passed and I began to grow more restless in my confinement, I tried reasoning with her, but it did no good. Mom grew defensive about her decision. She acted as if I wanted something to happen to me. When reason failed to break through the shroud of anxiety she'd so tightly wrapped around us, I tried arguing, pleading, and once, only once, I openly defied her and went out with the gang for a soda, after which I lost my telephone privileges indefinitely, and life grew even more dismal. In fairness to Mom, I do know she meant well. I know she was devastated by Dad's death and meant only to protect me. She didn't realize, though, that she was suffocating me and destroying the loving relationship we'd once shared. She did not understand that what she'd sentenced me to was so much worse than if I'd been with Dad when that semi hit our old pickup. I had no choice but to resign myself to remaining confined with the new boundaries Mom's irrational fears set for me. I lost my friends and much of my interest in life. There was no laughter in our home. We stopped talking, stopped caring. Anger and resentment took up permanent residence within me. Nearly 10 months had passed since Dad's death when I mentioned the dance at the high school down in Trenton. I did so purely out of reflex, caught up in the excitement of being back in school, remembering a time when Mom would have shared my excitement and would have encouraged me to go. I heard myself telling her and stiffened, waiting to hear her sigh softly, to see her arrange her once soft, youthful features deeper into sorrow's mask. I'd expected a quick, gentle pat on the arm, a small, almost imperceptible shrug of her shoulder, and silence. Oh, I expected those things, but they did not come. That morning, that beautiful sunny Monday morning, my world shifted unexpectedly. Mom smiled, the first smile I'd seen in so very, very long, and said perhaps I would be able to go to the dance. I sat in stunned silence, marveling at the excitement and anticipation that those words generated within me. I'd received my pardon. Giddy with happiness, I rushed off to school and told the gang I would be joining them on Friday, and predicted that in no time at all things would once again be back to normal. Sue Ann squealed with delight and hugged me. Jeannie offered to take me shopping for a new dress. Henry and Phil said they were glad I'd be coming along, said they'd missed me. Bobby, oh sweet, sweet Bobby, on whom I had a crush since I was 6 or 7, promised me a corsage in every slow dance. I could not have been happier, and my happiness made me acknowledge just how lonely and out of touch I'd been all those long months. I spent the week engrossed in preparations for Friday. I searched my closet over and over again for just the right dress to wear. I fussed and fiddled with my hair, determined to push and pull my limp, lifeless mop into stunning perfection. I was interested in life again, and it felt wonderful. Friday came at last. Mom and I still had not discussed the dance, the details of curfew, who would be driving, what time I would be leaving, nothing. A tiny voice in the back of my mind tried to be heard, tried to tell me I should sit down and straighten those things out, just to be certain. A louder, stronger voice, the one I wanted to hear, told me not to worry, that she'd said I could go, and to question her decision would be unwise. Naturally, I listened to that louder voice. It was the one that pleased me. Bobby was supposed to pick me up at 7:30, but I was dressed and ready long before that. I paced and fidgeted in my room until I could no longer avoid going downstairs. I found Mom in the living room watching TV. She glanced up at me and, without a word, returned her attention to the screen. I waited for her to acknowledge me, to actually see me. 5 minutes ticked agonizingly by before I managed to choke out a pitiful, "Well?" Mom dragged her eyes from the television and looked at me blankly. "Do you like it?" I did a clumsy twirl, and when I faced her again, I saw that look, felt her hand pat my arm, and I turned without a word to go back to my room. I have no idea whether minutes or hours passed between the moment I flung myself down on my narrow bed and my first awareness of soft, lilting music, dim lights, laughter, happiness. Sensations surrounded me, washed over me, coursed through me, intensified beyond belief. I could not speak to them, I could not reach out and touch them, but my other senses made up for those losses. I could hear each note of the music as I had never heard music before. I listened to jokes and gossip, heard girls giggling and boys boasting. I saw everything, it seemed, at once. The intricate, detailed pattern embroidered into Sue Ann's new dress, the tiny telltale spot of lipstick on Phil's cheek where Jeannie had kissed him, the ever so slightly wilted petals of corsages. Perfumes and aftershades mingled, not altogether unpleasantly, with the slightest hint of perspiration from the dancers. I drank in every detail eagerly, filled myself with the sights and sounds of the living, and found no disappointment in my inability to be seen or heard. To have expected it, or even wished for it, would have been absurd. I knew that, just as I knew well what had happened was not, as most would think, a dream. I was, in fact, with them, in spirit. I might not have known, might have believed the experience to be a dream, had I not once before unexpectedly taken such a trip out of my body. That first trip had been nearly a decade before, and had terrified me so I'd sworn I would never let it happen to me again. The circumstances surrounding my first and second experiences were so vastly different, though. I was as delighted on the second trip as I had been terrified on the first. I stayed until the dance ended, and the lights came on, and the room began to empty. I heard my friends discussing what they planned on doing next, and instead of returning to my place as I should have, I went with them. I could almost taste the footlongs and fries they ordered and gobbled down at Dinky's doghouse, and enjoyed more than I could ever have imagined cruising the streets of Trenton, listening to Bobby's tinny radio. I wanted the night to go on forever. I wanted to go on listening to them, watching them. They were so alive. When Bobby turned the car around and headed for home, I could hardly bear the loneliness and despair that swept over me. They would be going home to normality, and I would be returning to my emptiness. The night was clear, the streets dry. There was no reason for Bobby to lose control of the car on Cloverhill Curve, but he did. The old wagon crashed easily through the guardrails and hung suspended in the air for a moment. I listened to Sue Ann's high, piercing wail of terror, and Bobby's soft, trembling curse, the first I'd ever heard him utter. I watched their bodies stiffen, saw the helpless horror on their faces, smelled their fear, and knew their pain. The car went down, smashing against boulders, hurling bits and pieces of metal and glass into the darkness. Their bodies were tossed, torn, broken. And at the bottom of Cloverhill Cliff, we were reunited. When Dad returned to our spot and saw what I had done, he was outraged. He said it was one thing for me to go on play-acting, pretending to be living still, imagining that I had not been with him when the truck pushed us over Cloverhill Cliff. He said dying so young, allowances could be made, but pulling Bobby's car over the cliff could not be excused and would have to be dealt with. I go to trial next week, and I don't know what they do in this world when a crime such as mine has been committed. I can't help wondering, what can be worse than death?